The landscape of England in the latter years of the 16th century possesses a particular kind of quiet, a quiet that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of a low, continuous hum. It is a hum composed of many small and unremarkable things. The wind moves across the open fields of barley and rye, and the stalks bend in long, sighing waves that change the color of the land from silver green to dusty gold, depending on the angle of the light and the time of day. The light itself is often a soft, filtered grey, passing through a high veil of cloud that seems to be a permanent fixture of the sky, and it falls without sharp shadows upon the hedgerows and the rutted cart tracks. Sheep graze on the high wolds, their bleating a distant rhythmic sound that carries on the breeze but does not interrupt the greater stillness. In the villages, which are small clusters of wattle and daub cottages around a green or along a single muddy street, the sounds are those of daily labour, conducted at a steady, unhurried pace. A blacksmith's hammer strikes iron in a ring that is more thud than clang, muffled by the open door of the forge and the damp air. A woman draws water from a well with a creaking windlass and the splash of a wooden bucket breaking the surface far below. These are the sounds that have been heard for generations, and they are expected, and they are reassuring in their familiarity. But if you were to stand very still in one of these villages on a Sunday morning, you would notice another layer of sound, one that is equally regular, but perhaps less comforting to every ear. It is the sound of the church bell, not the frantic swinging peal of celebration or alarm, but the steady, measured tolling of a single bell, calling the parish to service. It is a sound that carries a legal weight as heavy as the bronze from which the bell is cast. The bell rings out across the thatched roofs and the vegetable plots, over the duck pond and the alder trees, and it marks the beginning of a time during which, by the law of the realm, every man, woman, and child of a certain age must be present within the stone walls of the parish church. The sound of the bell is a sound of unity, a sound of the state, a sound that binds the community together under the watchful eye of the monarch as the supreme governor of the Church of England. It is a sound that leaves no room for ambiguity. It is a clear, resonant note that travels across the damp grass of the churchyard and slips through the cracks of closed shutters on windows that face the lane. If you were to watch the lane at that moment, you would see a slow procession of figures. They move without haste. The farmer in his best broadcloth coat, the fabric stiff and smelling faintly of the chest in which it is kept all week. His wife walks beside him, her hands folded, her white linen coif tied neatly under her chin. The children follow in a line, their faces scrubbed and their hair damp and flat against their heads. They walk past the houses of their neighbours, and they nod, and they pass through the light gate into the churchyard, and the sound of their footsteps changes from the soft squelch of mud to the hard scrape of gravel, and then is lost entirely on the stone flags of the porch floor. The door closes behind them. The bell stops. For the next hour, the village is empty of its official life. The only sound that escapes the church is the low, rhythmic drone of the vicar reading from the Book of Common Prayer, a sound like the humming of bees in a lime tree, a sound of continuous, droning prose in English, a language that is now the only language of public prayer and public faith in the kingdom. And yet, the village is not entirely empty. There are always a few figures who are not on that path. You might not notice them at first because they are very good at not being noticed. You might see a thin trail of smoke rising from a chimney at a house that sits slightly apart from the others. A house of better stone, perhaps, with a small orchard behind a low wall. The smoke is a sign of life, a sign of a fire kept burning on the hearth. Inside that house, the sound of the church bell is heard just as clearly. It penetrates the walls and the heavy curtains with ease. It is a sound that cannot be ignored, and in the main hall, or in a small upper room at the back of the house, facing away from the road and the prying eyes of the village, a small group of people are also gathered. They are not sleeping, and they are not idle. They are sitting or kneeling on the wooden floorboards, and they are listening to a different kind of murmur, a sound that is softer than the drone of the prayer book, a sound that is almost not a sound at all, but rather the shape of a word spoken in a breath. It is the sound of Latin. This is the distant rumble of hardship. It is not a loud sound. It is not a battle cry or a cry of pain. It is a sound made by the careful placement of a foot on a creaking stair, a sound made by the turning of a page in a book that is kept hidden under a floorboard, a sound made by the counting of coins set aside not for seed or for rent, but for a fine. The fine is called recusancy. It is a legal term, a dry word found in the pages of the Acts of Parliament, and it means quite simply the refusal to attend the services of the established church. The law was not written in a single moment of fury, but was built up slowly, statute by statute, over the course of many years. First came the Act of Supremacy, which declared the monarch to be the only supreme head on earth of the church in England. Then came the Act of Uniformity, which made the use of the new Book of Common Prayer compulsory in all places of worship, and which imposed a fine of 12 pence for every absence from church on a Sunday or holy day. 12 pence. It is a small sum when spoken aloud, the price of a good meal at an inn or a few yards of coarse woolen cloth. But it is a sum that is levied, week after week, month after month, season after season. 12 pence for a farmer's absence, multiplied by the number of Sundays in a year, begins to weigh heavily on a household that is already paying tithes to the same church they refuse to attend, and taxes to the crown they wish to obey in all temporal matters. The fine is not the only weight. There is the weight of the law as it was later written, the law that made it a crime, punishable by ruinous fines and the seizure of 2/3 of one's estate, to harbour a priest or to attend a mass. There is the weight of the oath of supremacy, which required any person holding public office or any graduate of the university to swear that the monarch was the supreme governor of the church and that no foreign prince, person, prelate, state, or potentate had any jurisdiction, power, superiority, preeminence, or authority, ecclesiastical or spiritual, within this realm. This oath was a gate that closed firmly on the future prospects of any man or woman whose conscience was bound to the old ways, to the Bishop of Rome, to the traditions of 1,000 years. To swear the oath was to preserve one's land and one's place in the community. To refuse was to become a kind of ghost in one's own country, a person who could own land but not defend it, a person who could travel only so far from their own doorstep without a special license that cost more money and required humiliating sureties from conforming neighbours. And so the sound of the church bell on a Sunday morning, that simple, clear note, was for some a call to prayer and for others a sound of exclusion, a reminder that the door of the parish church was not a door that led to their version of God's house, and that the cost of staying away was a slow, grinding tax on their labour and their peace. The quiet of the English countryside in this time, therefore, is a complicated quiet. It is a quiet that contains a division that is never spoken of loudly, a line drawn not on a map, but through the centre of a village, sometimes through the centre of a single family. A brother who conforms and takes the bread and wine at the altar rail may farm the land next to a brother who pays the recusancy fine and walks 5 miles in the dark of night to hear a whispered mass in a hidden chamber. This is not a story of great armies or of loud ringing declarations. It is a story of the weight of small things, the weight of a 12-pence fine recorded in a dusty ledger, the weight of a floorboard that must be lifted silently, the weight of a gaze from a neighbour who notices that the candles in the back room burned late on a Saturday night. The hardship is not a single sharp blow. It is the pressure of a low grey sky that does not storm, but that also does not clear. It is the feeling of damp seeping into the stones of the house, a cold that is not severe but is perpetual. It is the sound of the rain falling on the thatch, a sound that is the same for everyone in the village, whether they were inside the church that morning or kneeling on a cushion in an upper room, listening for the sound of hoofs on the road, listening for the quiet knock on the door that means the coast is clear, listening to the soft ancient syllables of the faith that has been declared illegal and yet persists, like a small, carefully guarded flame in a room where the curtains are always drawn against the grey English light. The outside of the house gives away nothing. It is a structure built of local stone, grey and lichen-covered, with mullioned windows that look out upon the lane with the blank, placid expression of an old man who has seen everything and says nothing. The roof is of stone tiles, heavy and dark, and they overlap one another in a pattern that has not changed in 200 years. There is a front door made of oak, studded with iron nails, and it is set within a shallow porch that offers a small respite from the rain that falls so often in this part of the country. If you were to pass by this house on the road, as so many travellers and peddlers and riding officers do, you would see a home that is in good repair, a home that belongs to a family of some modest substance, but no great distinction. You might see a wisp of smoke from one of the chimneys, and you might smell the faint, pleasant scent of wood smoke mingling with the damp earth of the garden. You would see a woman in a grey woolen dress drawing water from the well, and you might hear the sound of a man's voice calling to a dog in the far pasture. All of this is true, and all of this is ordinary, and all of this is designed to be precisely that, true, ordinary, and unremarkable in every particular. But the inside of the house is a different matter. The inside of the house contains a secret that is not written in the lines of its plaster or the grain of its beams, a secret that is hidden not by magic or by complex machinery, but by the simple, patient and cumulative work of a family that has learned to see their own home as a place of both refuge and potential danger. The hallway is the first space you enter after stepping over the high stone threshold. It is a long, narrow passage that runs from the front of the house toward the back, and it is floored with broad oak boards that are worn smooth by generations of feet, and the boards are dark with age and with the beeswax that is rubbed into them once a year in the autumn. The walls of the hallway are panelled. The panelling is also of oak, and it rises from the floor to about the height of a tall man's shoulder, and above the panelling the walls are plastered and painted with a lime wash that has mellowed over time to a soft, creamy colour, the colour of old parchment or of the inside of an eggshell. There are sconces set into the walls, simple iron holders for tallow candles, and the light they cast is a warm, flickering orange that makes the shadows in the corners of the hallway seem to shift and breathe with a slow, quiet life of their own. There is a smell in the hallway. It is a compound smell, made up of the beeswax on the boards, the faint, dry scent of the lime plaster, the cool, earthy smell of the stone beneath the floor, and a trace of lavender from a bundle that hangs from a nail near the door to keep the moths from the woolen cloaks that hang on the wooden pegs. If you were to walk down this hallway, your footsteps would make a sound. That sound is very important. The old boards are not nailed down so tightly that they cannot move, and over the years they have learned a kind of language of creaks and groans, and each board has its own particular voice. The third board from the front door always lets out a long, low sigh, a sound like a man settling into a chair after a hard day. The seventh board, just before the turn toward the kitchen passage, emits a sharper, quicker complaint, a sound like the squeak of a mouse. The family knows these sounds as intimately as they know the sound of each other's breathing in the night. They know which boards to step on and which to avoid, and they know how to place the ball of the foot first and then roll the weight gently onto the heel so that the wood remains silent, and they know how to walk close to the wall where the boards are supported by a thicker joist and do not move at all. This knowledge is not written down anywhere. It is passed from mother to daughter, from father to son, in the way that one might teach a child how to churn butter or how to mend a bridle, as a simple fact of living in this particular house. At the end of the hallway, past the creaking seventh board and past the door that leads to the small parlour where the family takes its meals, there is a wall. It is a panelled wall just like the others, and to an outsider's eye it is perfectly unremarkable. The oak is the same dark, honeyed brown. The grain of the wood runs vertically in a pattern that matches the panelling on either side. There is a small decorative carving at the top of the centre panel, a simple motif of a stylized Tudor rose that is repeated in other parts of the house. There is no door here, there is no handle, there is no keyhole. There is nothing to suggest that this wall is anything other than what it appears to be, the end of the hallway, the boundary of the original house, a solid barrier between the main living quarters and the small, windowless pantry that is known to exist on the other side. And indeed, if you were to walk around the outside of the house and measure its dimensions with your paces, you might notice a discrepancy. You might notice that the distance from the front door to the back wall of the kitchen is some 5 or 6 feet longer than the space you can account for inside. But you would have to be looking for such a discrepancy, and you would have to be measuring with care, and most people who pass by this house are not looking and are not measuring. They are simply passing by. The truth of this wall is known only to those who live within the house and to the very few trusted souls who come to it in the dark of night. The panel with the carved Tudor rose is not fixed in place like the other panels. It is held by a system that is both ancient and simple. If you were to press your hand against a particular knot in the wood, a knot that looks like all the other knots but is in fact slightly smoother from the touch of many fingers, and if you were to push inward and then slide the panel to the left, it would move. It would move with a soft, grinding whisper of wood against wood, and it would reveal a dark, narrow opening. This is not a door. It is a passage, a low and cramped tunnel that leads into a small chamber that exists in the space that the outside measurements cannot account for. The chamber itself is not large. It is perhaps 6 feet by 8 feet, and the ceiling is low enough that a man of average height must stoop. There are no windows. The walls are of bare stone, and they are cold to the touch even in the height of summer, and they exude a faint mineral dampness that never quite dries out. The floor is of packed earth covered with a layer of straw that is changed every few months to keep the damp at bay. There is a small wooden stool in one corner and a narrow shelf carved into the stone wall where a single tallow candle can be placed, and there is a crucifix made of 2 simple pieces of polished boxwood tied together with a piece of faded red silk that hangs on the wall opposite the entrance. This is the closed room in the house. It is not a chapel in any grand sense. It is not adorned with gold leaf or rich vestments or paintings of the saints. It is a hole in the fabric of the building, a space of pure, unadorned necessity. It is a place where a man may kneel and say the prayers that have been said by his fathers and his fathers' fathers, the prayers that are now forbidden to be said aloud in any public place in the kingdom. It is a place where a travelling priest, a man dressed in the ordinary clothes of a tutor or a merchant, may say the Mass in a whisper so soft that it is barely louder than the sound of his own breathing. The Latin words of the canon fall into the still, damp air of the little room and are absorbed by the stone walls, and they make no echo, and they travel no farther than the thickness of the woolen curtain that hangs on the inside of the hidden panel to muffle any sound that might escape. The work of keeping this room is a quiet, domestic work, a work that is woven into the ordinary routines of the household in such a way that it becomes almost invisible, a part of the natural rhythm of the day, like drawing water or sweeping the hearth. The sweeping of the hallway floor is one such piece of work. It is done every morning, and it is done with a broom made of birch twigs bound together with a leather thong. The woman of the house, or sometimes her eldest daughter, begins at the front door and works her way slowly down the length of the hallway, pushing the dust and the small bits of dried mud and the stray pieces of straw before her in a growing pile. When she reaches the end of the hallway, she does not simply turn around and sweep the pile back toward the door. She sweeps it carefully into a small heap directly in front of the hidden panel, and then she sweeps it again, spreading the dust and the ash from the hearth in a thin, even layer across the threshold where the panel meets the floor. This is done so that if anyone should enter the house and walk down the hallway, they will see a continuous, undisturbed layer of fine grey dust and ash covering the floor all the way to the wall. There are no footprints leading to the panel. There are no scrape marks on the boards. The dust is a silent witness that says as clearly as any spoken word that no one has passed this way. Later in the day, when the coast is clear and the family is certain that no unexpected visitors are on the road, the dust will be swept up again and the panel will be opened for a brief time to allow a little air to circulate into the hidden chamber and to allow someone to go in and trim the wick of the candle and ensure that the straw on the floor is still dry. And then the panel is closed and the dust is swept back into place, and the hallway is once again a simple, unremarkable hallway that ends in a simple, unremarkable wall. There is also the matter of the curtain. In the small parlour that adjoins the hallway, there is a window that looks out onto the lane. It is a window of many small diamond-shaped panes of glass set in a lattice of lead, and it lets in a soft, diffuse light that is pleasant for sewing or reading. Over this window hangs a curtain made of heavy green wool. The curtain is drawn closed most days, not to keep out the light, though it does that as well, but to prevent anyone on the lane from seeing into the parlour, and, more importantly, from seeing the door to the hallway. If the curtain were open, a sharp-eyed passer-by might catch a glimpse of the panelled wall at the end of the hallway, and while there is nothing overtly suspicious about the wall itself, the family prefers that no one looks too long or too closely at any part of their home. The curtain is a simple barrier, a piece of fabric on a wooden rod, and yet it is also a piece of the great, slow, quiet labor of keeping a secret. The fabric is mended regularly. The hem is stitched and restitched. The rings that hold it to the rod are oiled with a drop of tallow so that they slide without sound. There is no hurry in this work. It is done in the evening by the light of the fire with the same patient attention that is given to darning a sock or sharpening a kitchen knife. It is the work of making a home safe, and it is work that is never finished. The children of the house learn these things without ever being formally taught. They learn that one does not run in the hallway. They learn that one does not speak loudly near the panelled wall. They learn to listen for the sound of hooves on the road, and they learn to distinguish the heavy, unhurried tread of the farmer who conforms and pays his tithes from the lighter, more purposeful trot of the riding officer who comes to collect the recusancy fine or to ask questions about the movements of strangers in the parish. They learn to be quiet in a way that other children are not quiet, to hold their breath when a shadow passes the window, to freeze in place like a hare in a field when the hawk's silhouette falls upon the grass. This quietness becomes a part of them, a second skin that they wear without thinking, and it is a quietness that will shape the whole of their lives in ways that they cannot yet understand. They will grow up knowing that their home is both a place of safety and a place of potential betrayal, that the walls themselves are not entirely solid, that the floorboards have voices, and that the sound of the church bell on a Sunday morning is not a call to worship, but a reminder to close the green wool curtain and to sweep the ash carefully across the threshold of the wall that is not a wall. The ledger sits on a low shelf in the small parlor, next to a wooden box that holds quills and a small stone bottle of ink. It is a book of ordinary appearance bound in brown calfskin that is worn smooth and dark at the corners from the touch of hands over many years. The pages are made of good, heavy paper, the kind that takes ink without bleeding or feathering, and they have yellowed only slightly with age, acquiring the color of wheat tea or of old cream left to stand in a cool pantry. The ledger is not kept hidden in the secret chamber behind the panelled wall. It sits in plain view on its shelf because there is nothing illegal about a book of household accounts. Every farm and every manor and every merchant's shop in England keeps such a book. A careful record of money that comes in and money that goes out, of bushels of wheat sold at markets and yards of woolen cloth purchased for winter coats, of wages paid to the man who comes to mend the thatch, and of the tithe owed to the parson. The ledger is a document of honest labor and honest trade, and it is meant to be seen by any man who might have cause to look. And yet, if you were to open this particular ledger and turn the pages slowly, letting your eye drift down the columns of neat, cramped handwriting, you would notice a line that appears again and again. A line that does not appear in the ledgers of every household in the parish. It is a line that is written always in the same hand, the hand of the master of the house, a man who learned his letters at a time when it was still possible to learn them from a priest, and his writing is careful and deliberate, each letter formed with a slow, considered pressure of the quill. The line reads, simply, "For the fine." Sometimes it is written out in full, "For the fine for recusancy." Sometimes it is abbreviated to "Rec. Fine" when the hand is tired or the ink is running low. And beside these words, in a column ruled with faint lines of graphite, is a number. The number is always the same, or nearly the same, varying only when the number of Sundays in a month changes, or when the quarter-day falls on a Sunday and the fine is assessed twice. 12 pence, 1 shilling, week after week, month after month, season after season. The line appears, and the number is written beside it, and the sum is subtracted from the total of the household's available coin. 12 pence is a small sum when you say it aloud. It is a single coin, a silver shilling that fits easily in the palm of a hand and weighs hardly anything at all. You could hold a shilling between your thumb and forefinger and feel the milled edge and the faint impression of the monarch's profile, and you could slip it into a pocket and forget that it is there. But the ledger does not forget. The ledger remembers every shilling, and the ledger adds them together with a quiet, relentless patience that is far greater than the patience of any man. If you were to turn to the back pages of the book, where the yearly sums are tallied, you would see the result of this weekly subtraction. The fine for a single Sunday is 12 pence. There are 52 Sundays in a year, and there are also a number of holy days and feast days on which attendance at the parish church is likewise required by law. days that the family does not observe because those days are no longer part of the official calendar of the Church of England, but remain part of the private calendar of the heart. Adding the Sundays and the holy days together, the total comes to roughly 60 occasions in a year on which the fine is levied. 60 shillings, £3. It is a sum that a labourer might earn in half a year of working in the fields from dawn to dusk. It is the price of a good milk cow, or of 6 healthy sheep, or of a bolt of fine woolen cloth sufficient to make coats for an entire family. The weight of this fine is not a sudden blow that knocks a man from his feet. It is a slow, steady pressure, a weight that is added to the shoulders in increments so small that they are almost imperceptible from one week to the next, and yet the cumulative effect, over the course of a year and then another year and then another, is the effect of a great stone placed upon the chest while one lies sleeping. The household must earn £3 more than its neighbours simply to stand in the same place, to have the same number of coins in the strong box at the end of the harvest. This means that the family must work a little harder, and sell a little more, and buy a little less, and the small economies that result from this necessity become woven into the fabric of daily life in ways that are both visible and invisible. The daughter's dress is mended one more time before a new one is made. The son's shoes are resoled with leather that is slightly thinner than the leather used for the first soles. The fire in the hearth is allowed to burn down to embers an hour earlier in the evening to save on the cost of wood. The candles are made of tallow rather than the more expensive beeswax, and they smoke and gutter and fill the room with the smell of rendered animal fat, a smell that clings to the curtains and the clothing and the hair. These are not dramatic sacrifices. They are the small, quiet adjustments of a family that is slowly, gently, inexorably being pushed toward the edge of its means. The ledger also contains other lines that tell the same story in a different way. There is a line for the cost of a license to travel. The law says that a known recusant may not travel more than 5 miles from his or her place of residence without a special license issued by the local justices of the peace. The license must be applied for in writing, and it must state the exact purpose of the journey and the exact dates of departure and return, and it must be accompanied by a fee. The fee is not as large as the weekly fine, but it is an additional weight on the scale, and it must be paid before the journey can be undertaken. There is a line in the ledger that reads, "License to visit my sister in Warwick, 2 shillings 6pence. There is another line that reads, "License to attend the wool market at Coventry, 1 shilling. Each journey, each visit to a family member, each necessary trip to buy or sell goods requires a small payment to the Crown for the privilege of moving freely upon the roads of one's own country." The payments are recorded in the ledger with the same careful handwriting, and they are added to the yearly total, and they represent another slow leak in the bucket of the household's prosperity. There is also the matter of the surety bonds. In order to obtain a license to travel, or to avoid the seizure of 2/3 of one's estate for the crime of persistent recusancy, the family must provide sureties. A surety is a bond, a promise of money to be paid if the recusant violates the terms of the license or fails to appear when summoned by the authorities. The sureties must be provided by conforming neighbours, men and women who attend the parish church, and who are willing to stake their own money and their own good names on the behaviour of a family that does not share their form of worship. Finding such neighbours is not always easy, and when they are found, their willingness to serve as surety often comes at a quiet, unspoken cost. The recusant family must be careful to give no offence, to pay its debts promptly, to avoid any public dispute that might cause the surety to withdraw his or her support. The family must be more agreeable, more accommodating, more invisible than its conforming neighbours, because the goodwill of those neighbours is a commodity that can be withdrawn at any moment and without warning. This is a weight that cannot be entered into the ledger, a weight of constant, low-grade anxiety that sits in the stomach like a stone and is never fully digested. The fine itself was not always 12 pence. In the early years of the reign, the fine was set at a lower rate, and it was collected only sporadically, depending on the zeal of the local churchwardens and the mood of the justices. But as the years passed and the political situation on the continent grew more tense, as the threat of invasion by Catholic powers and the memory of plots against the Queen's life became more vivid in the public mind, the laws were tightened and the fines were increased. The Act of Uniformity was amended and strengthened. The fine for recusancy was raised to £20 per lunar month for those who persistently refused to attend church, and who were deemed to be of sufficient means to pay such a sum. £20 a month was a fortune, a sum that only the wealthiest families could afford without selling their lands and their goods and reducing themselves to poverty. For those of more modest means, the fine remained at the lower rate, but the pressure to conform was increased in other ways. The names of recusants were recorded in the parish register and reported to the bishop and to the Privy Council. Their lands were surveyed, their movements were watched, their children were questioned. The fine was only the most visible part of a great machinery of enforcement that ground slowly and steadily, like a millstone turning in a river, reducing the grain of a family's life to a fine, uniform powder. In the ledger, you can see the effect of this grinding in the gradual changes that occur over the years. The handwriting remains the same, but the entries for other expenses grow fewer and more modest. In the early pages of the book, there are entries for a new cloak of good Lincoln green cloth, for a cask of French wine purchased at the port of Bristol, for a silver spoon to replace one that was lost. In the later pages, these entries disappear. The cloak is mended, the wine is replaced by small beer brewed at home, the silver spoon is not replaced. The money that might have been spent on small comforts and modest luxuries is instead sent to the exchequer, week after week, in the form of the fine. The family does not grow poorer in a visible, dramatic way. They do not starve. They do not lose their house. But the margins of their life grow thinner, and the buffer against a bad harvest or a sick animal or a sudden illness grows smaller, and the future becomes a thing that is approached with a quiet, constant apprehension rather than with any sense of hope or expectation. There is another book that sits on the same low shelf in the small parlour, a book that is not a ledger of money, but a ledger of a different kind. It is a small, thin volume bound in black leather, and it contains a list of names. The names are written in a tiny, precise script, and each name is followed by a date. These are the names of the priests who have come to the house over the years, the men who have slipped through the hidden panel and said the Mass in the low, windowless chamber at the end of the hallway. Beside each name is a date, and beside each date is a small symbol, a tiny cross or a simple circle, that indicates the outcome of the priest's work in England. Some of the symbols mean that the priest has moved on to another house, to another family, to continue his secret ministry. Some of the symbols mean that the priest has been captured, and a few of the symbols, very few, mean that the priest has been executed. This book is not a ledger of shillings and pence, but it is a ledger of a kind of cost, a cost that is measured not in coin, but in the quiet, steady erosion of the soul, the slow accumulation of grief and fear, and the knowledge that the knock on the door at midnight may bring either a friend or the end of everything. The two books sit side by side on the shelf, and together they tell the whole story of the hardship, the story of what it means to live in a house where the simple act of saying one's prayers in the old way requires the payment of a fine, the keeping of a secret, and the slow, patient acceptance of a weight that never grows lighter. The road that runs through the Shire in the autumn months is a thing of both use and beauty, a long, sinuous ribbon of packed earth and gravel that follows the contours of the land with a kind of patient, ancient wisdom. It does not cut straight across the fields like a Roman road. It meanders, dipping into shallow valleys and climbing gently over low hills, skirting the edges of woods and passing through villages that have grown up around it like moss around the base of an old tree. The surface of the road is firm in most places, beaten hard by the passage of carts and wagons and the hooves of countless animals over countless years. But in the autumn, after the first rains have come and the leaves have begun to fall, the surface acquires a particular character that is unique to this season. The hard-packed earth becomes slightly softer, not muddy in the way of winter, but yielding, so that a hoof or a boot leaves a clear, crisp impression that holds its shape for a day or two before the next rain washes it away. The fallen leaves, brown and gold and russet, lie scattered across the surface, and they are crushed into a fine, fragrant powder by the wheels of the carts, releasing a smell that is earthy and sweet and faintly sad, the smell of the year turning toward its end. On such a road, on a grey afternoon in late October, when the light is already beginning to fail, even though it is only the middle of the day, a single rider makes his way eastward. He is a man of middle age, neither young nor old, and he sits his horse with the easy, slumped posture of someone who has spent more hours in the saddle than he cares to count. His name is not important. He is known to the people of the Shire by his function, not by his person. He is a pursuivant, a minor officer of the ecclesiastical courts, a man whose duty it is to ride the roads and the lanes and the byways of the countryside and to look for things that are out of place. The word itself, pursuivant, is a French word that has been worn smooth by English tongues, and it means simply one who follows or one who pursues. But the following and pursuing that this man does is of a very particular and very slow kind. He does not gallop after fleeing criminals with a drawn sword. He does not burst through doors in the middle of the night. He rides at a steady, ambling walk, and he looks, and he listens, and he makes notes in a small leather-bound book that he keeps in the pocket of his coat. The horse he rides is a sturdy, patient animal, a gelding of a common brown color, with a white star on its forehead and one white sock on its left hind leg. The horse knows this road as well as the man does. It knows where the surface is soft and where it is firm, where the puddles collect after a rain, and where the overhanging branches of the oak trees create a tunnel of dry ground beneath. The horse's hooves make a steady, rhythmic sound on the packed earth, a sound that is 4 beats repeated over and over, a soft thud and scrape that blends with the creak of the saddle leather and the faint jingle of the bit rings and the small metallic clink of the buckles on the bridle. These sounds are the music of the road, a music that is heard by everyone who lives within earshot of the highway, and it is a music that carries a particular meaning. The sound of a single horse moving at a walk in the middle of a weekday afternoon is a sound that makes people look up from their work, makes them pause with a hand on a hoe or a needle in mid-stitch, makes them listen for a moment to determine the direction of the sound and the speed of the horse and the number of riders. A single horse at a walk is not alarming in itself, but it is a sound that requires attention because it might be a neighbor returning from market, and it might be a stranger passing through, and it might be the pursuivant on his rounds. The man in the saddle carries a list. The list is written on a piece of paper that is folded and refolded many times, and the creases are soft and beginning to tear from the constant handling. The paper contains the names of households in the Shire that are known or suspected to be recusant, households that have been reported to the bishop's court for failing to attend the services of the parish church. Beside each name is a brief notation, the amount of the last fine paid, the date of the last license issued for travel, the name of the surety who has stood bond for the family's good behavior, and any other small details that have come to the attention of the authorities. The list is not a long list. In this part of the Shire, the number of families who persist in the old faith is small. A handful of names scattered across the parish is like a handful of seeds thrown into a wide field. But each name on the list represents a household that must be watched, a door that might open in the night to admit a stranger, a room that might contain a hidden altar, a family that might be harboring a priest whose capture would bring a reward of £100, a sum that is more than the pursuivant will earn in 10 years of riding these roads. The pursuivant is not a cruel man, and he is not a zealous man. He is a tired man with a list. He has a wife at home and a small house with a garden that he tends on the rare days when he is not on the road, and he has a daughter who is married to a glover in the next town, and he has a bad knee that aches when the weather turns damp, which it does frequently in this part of England. He performs his duties because they are his duties, because the bishop's court pays him a small stipend, and because the work is steady and does not require him to do anything that troubles his conscience. He does not hate the recusants. He does not think about them very much at all, except as names on a list that must be checked and verified and reported upon. He is a cog in a great, slow-turning machine, a machine that was set in motion by Acts of Parliament and royal proclamations and the complex, distant workings of the Privy Council in London, a machine whose purpose is to enforce uniformity of worship throughout the realm. The machine turns very slowly, and it makes very little noise, but it is always turning, and the pursuivant's weekly ride is one of the small movements that keeps it in motion. As he rides, he looks at the landscape with the eyes of a man who has seen it 1,000 times before, and who no longer notices its beauty. The fields are brown and stubbled now, the harvest having been gathered in a month ago, and the sheep that graze on the higher pastures are thick with wool that will be sheared in the spring. The hedgerows are heavy with red berries, the hips of the wild rose and the haws of the hawthorn, and the birds are busy among the branches, eating their fill before the real cold comes. The trees are losing their leaves, and the bare branches make a dark, intricate lace against the pale grey sky, a pattern that shifts and changes as the horse moves along the road, and the angle of view alters. The air smells of wood smoke and damp earth, and the faint, sharp tang of rotting apples from an orchard that lies just out of sight, behind a low stone wall. All of this is pleasant enough, in a quiet, melancholy way, but the pursuivant does not register it as pleasant or unpleasant. He registers it simply as the background against which his work is done, the familiar, unchanging scenery of a long and uneventful ride. The first stop on his round is a small village that clusters around a green with a duck pond in the centre. The village is called Little Hampton, and it consists of perhaps 20 houses, a smithy, and the parish church of St. Laces, Mary the Virgin, a sturdy stone building with a square tower that can be seen from miles away across the flat fields. The pursuivant does not go to the church. He goes instead to the house of the church warden, a man named Thomas Brewer, who keeps the keys to the parish chest and who is responsible for reporting the names of those who fail to attend divine service. Thomas Brewer is a man of about 60 years, with a red face and a fringe of white hair around a bald pate, and he is sitting on a bench outside his door, mending a piece of harness when the pursuivant rides up. The two men know each other well. They've been doing this same business for many years, and there is no need for elaborate greetings. The pursuivant dismounts slowly, his knee complaining as his weight comes down onto the ground, and he loops the reins over a post and walks over to the bench. He takes the folded list from his pocket and smooths it out on his thigh. The conversation that follows is quiet and brief, and entirely without drama. The church warden reports that the same families have been absent from church on the same pattern as before. The family at the old manor house by the river, the one with the hidden room that everyone knows about but no one can prove, sent no one to church on Sunday last, or the Sunday before that, or any Sunday in the past 6 months. The fine has been paid, as it always is, in good silver coin, delivered by a servant to the churchwarden's door on the Monday morning following each absence. The coin is counted and recorded in the parish register, and a receipt is written out and given to the servant, and the matter is closed until the following week. The pursuivant makes a small mark on his list, a tiny tick beside the name of the manor house family, and he asks if there has been any sign of unusual activity, any strangers seen on the roads, any lights burning late in the windows, any sounds of singing or chanting that might indicate a secret gathering. The churchwarden shakes his head slowly. There has been nothing, he says. The house is quiet, the family keeps to itself. The servants come and go on their ordinary errands. There is nothing to report. The pursuivant nods and folds his list and puts it back in his pocket. He does not press the matter. He is not expected to press the matter. His job is to observe and to record, not to investigate or to prosecute. If there is nothing to report, then there is nothing to report, and he will write in his own small book that evening that the household at the manor house remains quiet and compliant with the law in all outward respects. He knows, as everyone in the shire knows, that the outward compliance is a mask. He knows that there is a priest hidden somewhere in that house, or that a priest comes and goes under cover of darkness, or that the family gathers in a secret room to say the forbidden prayers. But knowing a thing and proving a thing are two different matters entirely, and the pursuivant is not paid to tear down panelling or to dig up floorboards. He is paid to ride his rounds and to make his marks and to collect the information that is then sent up the long, slow chain of ecclesiastical bureaucracy, a chain that stretches from the churchwarden to the bishop's court, to the archbishop's consistory, to the privy council itself, and somewhere along that chain, perhaps, a decision will be made to take a harder line, to demand a search, to impose a heavier fine. But that decision will not be made by the pursuivant. It will be made by men in warmer rooms, men who do not have aching knees, and who do not spend their days riding through the grey autumn landscape. He mounts his horse again, the saddle creaking as he settles his weight into it, and he clicks his tongue softly, and the horse moves forward, walking slowly out of the village and back onto the open road. The next name on the list is in a different parish, 5 miles to the east, and the road between the two places is a long, straight stretch that crosses a wide, flat plain where the wind blows without obstruction, and the only sounds are the sigh of the grass and the distant call of a crow. The pursuivant lets the horse find its own pace, and he allows his mind to drift into a state that is not quite thought and not quite sleep, a state of passive awareness that is familiar to anyone who has spent long hours on the road with no company but the sound of hooves and the creak of leather. He thinks about his garden, about the row of cabbages that he planted too late and that will probably not amount to anything before the first hard frost. He thinks about his wife's cooking, about the rabbit stew she makes with onions and carrots and a little thyme, and he hopes that she will make it tonight, because the ride has been long and the air is cold, and a bowl of hot stew would be a fine thing to come home to. He thinks about his knee, which is aching more than usual, and he wonders if he should stop at the apothecary in the next town to buy some of the ointment that smells of camphor and goose, and that seems to help a little, though not as much as he would like. These are the thoughts of an ordinary man doing an ordinary job, and they are thoughts that contain no malice and no particular zeal. And yet, the shadow that this man casts as he rides along the road is a long shadow, a shadow that falls across the landscape and touches the lives of people he has never met and will never know. In the manor house by the river, the family has heard the sound of his horse's hooves on the road, and they have drawn the green wool curtain a little tighter and swept the ash a little more carefully across the threshold of the hidden panel, and they have held their breath until the sound fades into the distance. The children have been told to be quiet, to play in the back garden where they cannot be seen from the road, to speak in low voices, and to avoid the front windows. The servant who delivers the fine money to the church warden's door on Monday mornings has been told to walk slowly and to speak to no one, and to return directly to the house without stopping at the inn or the market. All of these small, careful actions are performed because of the man on the horse, because of the list in his pocket, because of the great, slow-turning machine of which he is a part. The machine does not need to be cruel to be effective. It only needs to be present, to be visible on the road, to make its rounds with a steady, bureaucratic regularity that never wavers and never forgets. The pursuivant reaches the second village as the light is beginning to fade from the sky, the grey of the afternoon deepening into the softer grey of early evening. The village is smaller than the first, a mere scattering of houses around a crossroads, and there is no inn and no smithy, and only a tiny chapel that is served by a curate who rides over from the next parish once a fortnight. The pursuivant stops at the house of the headborough, a local man who serves as a kind of unpaid constable, and he asks the same questions and receives the same answers. The Recusant family in this parish is an elderly widow who lives alone with a single maid, and she has not attended church in 20 years, and she pays her fine every month without fail, and she gives no trouble to anyone, and there is no sign of any priest or any secret gathering. The headborough shrugs his shoulders. The widow is old and harmless, he says, and her money is good, and he sees no reason to trouble her further. The pursuivant makes his mark on the list and thanks the man and turns his horse toward home. The ride back is slower than the ride out, because the horse is tired and the man is tired and the light is almost gone. The road is a pale ribbon in the dusk, and the trees on either side are dark shapes that seem to lean in close, and the sounds of the evening are the sounds of birds settling into the branches and the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. The pursuivant does not hurry. He lets the horse pick its way along the familiar route, and he thinks about the stew and the fire and the warm bed that awaits him. He is not thinking about the old widow in her small house, or the family in the manor by the river, or the children who have been told to be quiet. He is thinking about his cabbages and his knee, and the cold that is seeping through his cloak. And yet the shadow that he casts moves ahead of him and behind him, and to either side, a shadow that is made not of darkness, but of the knowledge that someone is always watching, that the road is never truly empty, that the list in the pocket of a tired man on a brown horse contains the names of those who have chosen to live apart, and that the cost of that choice is measured not only in shillings and pence, but in the constant low-grade awareness of the sound of hooves on the road, a sound that is the music of this maid. The fields that lie between the village of Littlehampton and the manor house by the river are fields that have been worked by the same families for as long as anyone can remember, and the boundaries that separate one man's land from another's are marked not by fences or walls for the most part, but by ancient hedgerows of hawthorn and blackthorn and elder, hedgerows that are thick and tangled and full of the nests of small birds. These hedgerows are living things, and they require a certain amount of care, a trimming back of the new growth in the late winter when the sap is still low and the birds have finished with the berries, and this work is done by the men of the village in a slow communal rhythm that stretches over many weeks. The work is not hard, but it is steady, and it provides an occasion for the men to stand together in the cold air and talk in low voices about the weather, and the price of wool and the doings of their neighbours. It is in these conversations, conducted over the snip of shears and the crackle of dead branches being pulled from the hedge, that the fabric of the community is woven and rewoven, thread by thread, year by year. The family from the manor house is not present at the hedge trimming. They've never been present at the hedge trimming, or at the mending of the lane after the spring rains, or at the raising of a new barn for a neighbour whose old one was blown down in a storm. These are the common works of the parish, the labours that are not compelled by law, but by custom and by neighbourliness, and they are labours from which the recusant family is quietly, gently, and completely absent. The men of the village do not speak of this absence in so many words. It is not a thing that is discussed openly, because to discuss it openly would be to acknowledge it, and to acknowledge it would be to invite questions about why the family does not come, and whether the family should be made to come, and what the law requires of those who associate with known recusants. These are not questions that anyone wishes to answer, and so the absence is simply noted in the way that one notes the absence of a bird that used to sing in a particular tree, and now sings no longer, a small sad silence that becomes, over time, a part of the ordinary background of the world. The harvest is a different matter. The harvest is the great event of the agricultural year, the culmination of months of ploughing and sowing and weeding and waiting, and it is a time when every pair of hands in the parish is needed and expected. The wheat and the barley and the rye must be cut and gathered and bound into sheaves and stacked into stooks to dry in the field before they can be carted to the barn and threshed. The work is hard and it is urgent, because the weather in England is never entirely reliable, and a week of rain at the wrong moment can ruin a crop that has been tended for a year. In a normal parish, in a parish where everyone worships in the same church and recites the same prayers from the same book, the harvest is a time of intense, sweaty, cheerful community. The men move through the fields in a line, swinging their sickles in a steady, rhythmic arc, and the women follow behind to gather the cut stalks and bind them, and the children bring jugs of small beer and baskets of bread and cheese to keep the workers fed. The sound of the harvest is a sound of human voices calling back and forth, of laughter and of song, of the swish of the sickle and the rustle of the dry stalks. It is a sound of unity, a sound of shared purpose, a sound that says that we are all in this together and that we will all share in the bounty when the work is done. In the fields that lie between the village and the manor house, the harvest proceeds in the same way, with the same urgency and the same labour, but there is a difference that is subtle and yet unmistakable. The family from the manor house does not come to help with the harvest. They have their own fields to harvest, and they do that work themselves, with their own servants and their own hired labourers, men who are brought in from a neighbouring parish and who do not stay in the village after the work is done. The family works hard, and their fields are well tended, and their grain is gathered in good time and stored safely in their own barn. But they do not join the communal effort, and they do not share in the communal relief and joy when the last sheaf is cut and the harvest is declared complete. The boundary between their land and the land of the village is a hedgerow, a thick green living wall of thorn and leaf, and during the harvest that boundary seems to grow a little higher, a little thicker, a little more substantial. The sounds of the village harvest carry across the fields on the wind, the laughter and the calling and the singing, and those sounds reach the ears of the family working in their own fields, and they are sounds of a world from which they are gently but firmly excluded. The harvest supper is the final act of the agricultural year, a feast that is held in the largest barn of the village when the last of the grain has been threshed and the straw has been stacked and the long winter wait begins. The women of the village spend days preparing the food, roasting great joints of beef and mutton, baking pies and puddings, tapping barrels of ale and cider that have been saved for this occasion. The trestle tables are set up in the barn, and the candles are lit, and the fire is built high, and the whole parish gathers to eat and drink and be merry, to celebrate the successful completion of the work that sustains them all. The parson says a prayer of thanksgiving, a prayer from the Book of Common Prayer, and everyone bows their heads and says Amen, and then the feasting begins. There is music, a fiddle and a pipe and a drum, and there is dancing, and there are games for the children. And there is a general sense of warmth and goodwill, and shared relief that the year's labour has been rewarded, and that the barns are full, and that the winter, however cold and dark it may be, will not be a winter of hunger. The family from the manor house does not attend the harvest supper. They have never attended the harvest supper. They are not invited, and they do not expect to be invited, and this mutual understanding is a part of the quiet, unspoken arrangement that governs the life of the parish. The every fives in the village, the conforming families who attend the church and say the prayers and pay their tithes, are not unkind people. They are not filled with hatred for their recusant neighbours. Many of them have known the family for generations, and there are bonds of blood and marriage and shared history that connect them, however tenuously, to the people in the manor house. But the law is the law, and the law says that anyone who knowingly harbours or assists a recusant, anyone who attends a secret mass, anyone who fails to report suspicious activity to the authorities, is themselves liable to fines and imprisonment and the seizure of their property. The law casts a wide net, and it catches not only the recusant who refuses to attend church, but also the conforming neighbour who shows too much friendship or too much sympathy or too much tolerance. And so the conforming neighbours are careful. They are very, very careful. This carefulness manifests itself in 1,000 small ways that are almost invisible to an outsider, but that are as clear as a shout to those who live within the parish. The farmer who lives on the land adjacent to the manor house will stop to talk to the master of the manor if they meet on the road, and they will discuss the weather, and the price of wool, and the health of their respective livestock. And the conversation will be pleasant and civil and entirely without substance. But the farmer will not invite the master of the manor into his house for a cup of ale. He will not accept an invitation to step inside the manor house, even for a moment, even to warm his hands by the fire on a cold day. He will not allow his children to play with the children of the manor, and he will gently steer his wife away from the lane that leads to the manor house when they are walking to the village on a Sunday morning. These are not acts of cruelty. They are acts of self-preservation, small, sad, necessary cuts that sever the natural bonds of neighbourliness in order to protect one's own family from the long, slow reach of the law. The women of the village feel this distance most acutely, because the work of women is often work that is done together, in company, with hands busy and tongues wagging. The washing is done at the stream on a Monday morning, and the women kneel side by side on the grassy bank and beat the wet clothes against the stones and talk about their children and their husbands and the small dramas of parish life. The spinning is done in the long winter evenings, when the women gather in one house or another and sit by the fire with their distaffs and their spindles, turning the raw wool into yarn and filling the room with the soft, rhythmic whir of the wheels. The preserving and the pickling and the brewing are done in the autumn, when the fruit is ripe and the vegetables are ready, and the kitchens are busy with steam and heat, and the sharp, sweet smells of vinegar and sugar and spices. In all of these activities, the women of the conforming families are present, and the women of the manor house are absent. It is not that the women of the manor house are incapable of washing and spinning and preserving. They do all of these things, and they do them well, but they do them alone or with their own servants in the quiet of their own kitchen and their own still room. The absence is a silence that hangs in the air of the village, a silence that is noticed and regretted, and then, with a small sigh, accepted. There is one family in the village, however, that maintains a slightly closer connection to the manor house, a connection that is tenuous and secret, and fraught with a quiet, constant anxiety. This is the family of the blacksmith, a man named John Fletcher, whose forge stands at the edge of the village green and whose hammer rings out from dawn to dusk. John Fletcher's wife, Anne, is a distant cousin of the lady of the manor house, a connection that goes back to a marriage between two families that occurred long before the present troubles began, and the laws were tightened, and the lines were drawn. Anne Fletcher does not speak of this connection to her neighbours. She does not mention it at the washing stream or at the spinning circle, but once a month, sometimes twice, she will walk the long path that leads to the back gate of the manor house, carrying a basket that contains nothing more remarkable than a few fresh eggs, or a pot of honey, or a bundle of herbs from her garden. She will knock softly on the back door, and she will be admitted by a servant, and she will sit for an hour in the kitchen of the manor house and talk to her cousin in low voices about the small, safe things of life, the health of the children, the progress of the garden, the price of cloth at the market. She will not speak of religion. She will not ask about the hidden room. She will not mention the sound of the church bell, or the name of the priest, or the weight of the fine. And when she leaves, she will walk back to the village by a different path, a path that is less visible from the road, and she will tell no one where she has been. This small secret kindness is a thread that connects the two worlds, a thread that is fine and fragile and could be broken at any moment by a word spoken in the wrong ear or a glance that lingers too long. The blacksmith knows about his wife's visits, and he does not forbid them, but he does not speak of them either. He understands that the law is a thing of sharp edges and heavy weights, and he understands that his family's safety depends on a careful, constant silence. He shoes the horses of the manor house when they are brought to his forge, and he does a good job, and he charges a fair price, and he says nothing more than is necessary to conduct the business. He does not ask after the family. He does not inquire about their health or their plans. He takes the horse, and he lifts the hoof, and he trims the horn, and he nails the shoe in place, and he collects his coin, and he watches the horse and its rider depart back down the lane toward the manor house. And then he turns back to his forge and his fire and his hammer, and he does not think about the things he does not allow himself to think about. The children of the village are the ones who feel the distance most keenly and who understand it least. They see the children of the manor house sometimes, walking along the lane with their mother, or playing in the orchard behind the high stone wall, and they are curious in the way that children are curious in the way that children are curious about anyone who is different from themselves. But they have been told, gently and firmly and repeatedly, that they are not to play with those children, that they are not to speak to them, that they are to keep to their own side of the hedgerow and their own end of the lane. The reasons for this prohibition are not explained in detail, because the reasons are too complicated and too dangerous to put into the words that a child can understand. And so the children of the village grow up with a vague, unformed sense that there is something different about the family in the manor house, something that is not spoken of, something that makes their parents lower their voices and shake their heads and look away. They learn, without ever being taught, that there are lines in the world that cannot be crossed, boundaries that are as real and as solid as the stone wall that surrounds the manor's orchard, even if they are not marked on any map. The seasons turn and the years pass, and the distance between the manor house and the village remains the same, a distance that is measured not in miles or in furlongs, but in the small, accumulated silences of 1,000 ordinary days. The family in the manor house continues to pay its fines and keep its secrets and live its quiet, restricted life. The families in the village continue to attend their church and pay their tithes and live their own quiet, unrestricted lives. And between them, in the fields and along the lanes and across the hedgerows, there is a space that is empty and full at the same time. A space that contains all the words that are never spoken, and all the gestures that are never made, and all the gestures that are never made, and all the small, natural kindnesses that are withheld. Not out of malice, but out of a sad, slow, grinding necessity. The absence is a weight that both sides carry, a weight that is never mentioned but is always felt, a weight that is as much a part of the landscape as the grey stone of the church tower, or the brown ribbon of the road, or the soft, persistent rain that falls on the just and the unjust alike, falling on the roof of the manor house and the thatch of the village cottages, with the same gentle, indifferent sound. The clothes that a man wears are not merely coverings for his body, not merely protections against the cold and the rain and the prying eyes of the world, but they are also a kind of language, a silent speech that announces to anyone who cares to look who the man is and what he does and where he belongs in the great, ordered hierarchy of the realm. A lord wears velvet and silk and fur, and the cut of his doublet and the length of his hose and the ornament upon his cap tell a story of wealth and power and ancient lineage. A farmer wears wool and linen, coarse and sturdy and plain, dyed in the browns and greys and dull greens that are the colours of the earth itself, and his clothes tell a story of labour and simplicity and a life lived close to the soil. A merchant wears good broadcloth, not so fine as a lord's, but finer than a farmer's, and his clothes tell a story of trade and prosperity and a certain modest ambition. A scholar wears a gown of black stuff, plain and sober, and his clothes tell a story of learning and contemplation and a life removed from the vanities of the world. And a priest of the old faith, a man ordained according to the ancient rites and sent back into England from the seminaries across the sea, wears clothes that tell a story that must be a lie, a careful, patient, well-constructed lie that is stitched into every seam and folded into every seam and folded into every pleat and worn like a second skin that must never, ever slip. The priest who travels the roads of England in these years does not wear a cassock. He does not wear a biretta upon his head, or a stole around his neck, or a chasuble over his shoulders. These garments, the garments of his true calling and his deepest identity, are folded away in a chest in a safe house in London or hidden behind a false wall in a manor house in the Shires, and they are brought out only in the dead of night, in a room with no windows and thick curtains and a watchful servant at the door. For the rest of his life, which is to say for the vast majority of his waking hours, the priest wears the clothes of an ordinary Englishman of the middling sort. He wears a doublet of grey or brown wool, cut in the fashion of the time, but not in the extreme of fashion, with sleeves that are full but not overly padded, and a waist that is fitted but not exaggerated. The doublet is buttoned up the front with a row of small plain buttons made of wood or horn or sometimes of brass, if the disguise requires a touch of modest prosperity, and the buttons are sewn on with strong linen thread in a stitch that is small and even and entirely unremarkable. Over the doublet he wears a jerkin or a cloak, depending on the weather and the season and the requirements of the role he is playing. The jerkin is of leather or of heavy wool, and it is worn and scuffed in a way that speaks of long use and hard travel and a life lived on the road rather than in the cloister. The cloak is of good, serviceable cloth, lined with a thinner wool for warmth, and it is fastened at the neck with a simple hook and eye or a plain metal clasp. The breeches are of the same modest cloth as the doublet, and they are cut full in the thigh and taper to the knee, where they are fastened with ties or buttons. The stockings are of wool, knitted by some unseen hand in a distant cottage, and they are a neutral colour, a brown or a grey or a faded green, and they have been darned in several places with a careful, almost invisible stitch that speaks of economy and thrift. The shoes are of good leather, stout and practical, with a low heel and a rounded toe, and they are the shoes of a man who walks many miles and who cannot afford to have his feet fail him. On his head he wears a cap of felt or knitted wool, plain and dark, pulled down low over his brow, but not so low as to seem furtive or suspicious. In his hand he carries a staff or a walking stick, a length of seasoned ash or hazel that has been smoothed by use and that serves both as a support on the long rutted roads and as a subtle sign of his occupation as a traveller, a tutor, a merchant's agent, or any one of the dozen harmless identities that he has learned to inhabit. The transformation from priest to ordinary man is not accomplished by the clothes alone, though the clothes are a large and essential part of it. The transformation requires a different way of standing, a different way of moving, a different way of holding the hands and the head and the eyes. A priest who has spent years in a seminary, years of kneeling and praying and studying and moving with the slow, deliberate gravity of the sacred liturgy, carries himself in a way that is subtly but unmistakably different from a man who has spent his life in the fields or the markets or the counting-houses of England. The priest's posture is upright, his shoulders squared, his head held in a way that suggests a constant interior attention to things that are not of this world. His hands are often folded, the fingers interlaced or the palms pressed together, a habit that is so deeply ingrained that he does it without thinking. His gaze is direct and calm, the gaze of a man who is accustomed to looking into the faces of other men and seeing their souls rather than their station. All of these small unconscious signs must be erased and replaced with the signs of a different kind of man. And so the priest who returns to England learns to stand with his weight on one hip, a slight, casual slouch that speaks of long hours of waiting and watching and a certain weary familiarity with the road. He learns to let his hands hang loosely at his sides, or to tuck them into his belt, or to hold them behind his back in a way that is natural and unthinking. He learns to walk with a longer, more rolling stride, the stride of a man who has covered many miles and who expects to cover many more rather than the measured, deliberate pace of the cloister or the sanctuary. He learns to let his gaze drift across the landscape, to notice the weather and the condition of the road and the quality of the crops rather than fixing it upon some interior horizon. He learns to speak in the accents and the idioms of the ordinary Englishman, to use the small, rough words of daily life, to talk about the price of wool and the chances of rain and the state of the roads, and to avoid any word or phrase that might suggest a knowledge of Latin or a familiarity with the debates of the schools or a concern for the fate of souls. All of this is learned slowly and painfully and with a constant, quiet attention, because a single slip, a single moment of inattention, a single gesture that belongs to the old life rather than the new, can mean the end of everything. The tailor who makes the clothes for the priest is a person of immense and quiet importance in the great secret network that sustains the old faith in England. The tailor is not a priest himself in most cases, but he is a man or a woman who understands the stakes and who is chosen, for reasons of conscience or family or simple human decency, to place his or her skills at the service of the hidden church. The tailor's shop is an ordinary shop, in an ordinary street, in an ordinary town, and it does the ordinary business of making and mending clothes for the ordinary people who live there. A customer comes in, a man of middling height and middling years and middling appearance, and he asks for a new doublet or a new cloak or a new pair of breeches, and the tailor measures him with a tape and writes down the numbers in a small book and discusses the choice of cloth and the style of the cut and the date when the garment will be ready. All of this is entirely unremarkable, and any neighbor who happened to look in through the window would see nothing more than a commonplace transaction between a tailor and his customer. But the tailor knows. The tailor knows that the man who stands before him, the man with the calm eyes and the slightly foreign way of pronouncing certain English words, is not a traveling merchant or a tutor from the next county. The tailor knows that this man is a priest, and that the clothes he is making are not merely clothes, but a kind of armor, a disguise that must be perfect in every detail if the man is to survive. And so the tailor sews with a care that goes beyond the ordinary care of his trade. He makes sure that the seams are straight and strong, and that the cloth hangs properly, and that the buttons are secure, and that the whole garment has the look of something that has been worn by the same man for a year or two, something that is comfortable and familiar and entirely without distinction. He may even, if the disguise requires it, take a new garment and rub it gently with a stone to soften the fabric, or apply a little stain to the cuffs and the collar to simulate the honest dirt of travel and labor. He may add a carefully mended tear or a replaced button that does not quite match the others, small touches of verisimilitude that will make the priest look less like a man in a costume and more like a man in his own clothes. The tailor's work is slow and painstaking and done in the quiet hours of the evening when the shop is closed and the shutters are drawn and the only light comes from a single candle on the workbench. The tailor sits with his needle and his thread and his shears and his thimble, and he stitches the grey wool and the brown linen and the black broadcloth, and he thinks about the man who will wear these clothes and the roads he will travel and the dangers he will face. The tailor does not know the details of the priest's work. He does not know which safe houses the priest will visit, or which families he will serve, or which masses he will say in which hidden rooms. He knows only that the clothes he makes must not draw attention, must not provoke questions, must not fail in any particular. The stitch that holds the seam together is a small thing, a thing that is invisible to anyone who is not looking for it. But it is also a thing of immense consequence, because a seam that splits, or a button that falls off, or a hem that comes undone might cause the priest to pause on the road to make a repair, and that pause might bring him to the attention of a passing constable, or a curious neighbour, or a pursuivant on his rounds, and that attention might lead to questions, and those questions that this baffable tafflead give of great topic will be to get how often what's built with that a big extent of the The tailor's stitch, small and neat and strong, is a stitch that holds the whole fragile edifice of the secret church together. The priest himself is often aware of the irony of his situation, the strange upside-down logic of a life in which the most sacred acts are performed in the most ordinary of clothes. He says the Mass in a hidden room, a room that is no bigger than a pantry, and that smells of damp stone and old straw, and he wears over his ordinary doublet and breeches the ancient vestments of his office, the alb and the stole and the chasuble, garments that are made of silk and velvet and embroidered with gold thread, garments that are made of silk and velvet and embroidered with gold thread, garments that have been smuggled into the country at great risk and great cost, and that are kept hidden in a chest behind a false wall. For the space of an hour he is a priest again, a man set apart, a man who stands at the altar and speaks the words of consecration and holds in his hands the body and blood of his Lord. And then the Mass is over, and the vestments are folded away, and the chalice and paten are wrapped in linen and hidden in their secret place, and the priest is once again a man in a grey wool doublet and a worn leather jerkin, a man who must walk out into the road and look like any other traveller, and speak like any other Englishman, and carry himself like a man who has nothing to hide. This constant shifting between two identities, two ways of being in the world, is a kind of slow, grinding labour that wears upon the soul in ways that are difficult to describe. The priest learns to hold the two selves apart, to keep the sacred and the profane in separate compartments of his mind, because to let them mingle would be to risk a confusion that could be fatal. He learns to pray in silence, to say the offices of the day in a whisper that is barely louder than his own breathing, to make the sign of the cross in a way that is so small and so subtle that it looks like nothing more than a man adjusting his collar or brushing a fly from his face. He learns to receive the confessions of the faithful in a low murmur, his head bent close to theirs, his words a soft, continuous stream that is swallowed up by the ambient noise of the house or the road or the field. He learns to carry the Blessed Sacrament upon his person, hidden in a small flat box that is sewn into the lining of his doublet or concealed in a hollowed-out compartment of his walking staff, and he learns to walk with the same easy rolling stride while bearing the weight of what he believes to be the very presence of God, a presence that is invisible and silent and yet more real to him than the stones of the road beneath his feet. The clothes that the priest wears become, over time, a kind of second nature, a skin that he inhabits so fully that he sometimes forgets he is wearing a disguise at all. He catches himself thinking in the rhythms of the ordinary Englishman, worrying about the weather and the price of bread and the condition of his shoes, and he has to remind himself, in the quiet of his own mind, that he is not this man, that he is a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek, that his true home is not in any house in England, but in the eternal city that is above. And then he hears the sound of a horse on the road, or he sees a face in a window that lingers too long, or he feels the slight, familiar pressure of the hidden pyx against his chest, and he remembers who he is and what he carries and what he risks. The memory is a cold wash of clarity, a sudden sharpening of the senses, and it passes as quickly as it came, leaving behind a residue of quiet, constant vigilance that is as much a part of his clothing as the grey wool and the brown linen and the small, strong stitches of the tailor's needle. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes with wearing a disguise that is also a vocation, a loneliness that is not the loneliness of the hermit in his cell, but the loneliness of the man who stands in a crowd and is utterly unknown. The priest walks through the market square of a small town, and he sees the faces of the people around him, the farmers and the merchants and the good wives and the children, and he knows that among those faces there are some who share his faith, some who would kneel before him and confess their sins and receive his blessing if they knew who he was. But he cannot speak to them. He cannot meet their eyes for more than a passing glance. He cannot give any sign of recognition or kinship or shared belief. He must walk through the crowd as a stranger, a man with no name and no history and no connections, a man who is going about his own private business, and who has no interest in the lives of those around him. And the faithful, for their part, must do the same. They must pass him by with the same blank, incurious gaze that they would give to any other traveller on the road, because to do otherwise, to show a flicker of recognition or a hint of reverence or even a simple human warmth, would be to betray him and themselves and the whole fragile web of secrecy that sustains them all. The tailor, in his quiet shop, understands something of this loneliness, though he would never presume to speak of it. He understands that the clothes he makes are not just clothes, but a kind of solitude made visible, a barrier between the priest and the world that is both a protection and a prison. And so he sews with a particular tenderness, a particular attention to the small comforts that can be woven into a garment, the softness of the lining against the skin, the warmth of the wool, the ease of the fit that allows a man to walk all day without chafing or binding. These are small things, things that the priest himself may never consciously notice, but they are things that make the long, lonely road a little easier to bear. The tailor's stitch is a stitch of love, a love that is silent and practical and expressed in the only language that is safe to use, the language of cloth and thread, and the careful, patient work of the hands. And when the priest puts on the doublet and the jerkin and the cloak, and when he walks out of the shop and into the grey English light, he carries with him, without knowing it, the tailor's quiet blessing, a blessing that is not spoken aloud but is woven into every seam and every hem, a blessing that will travel with him down the long roads and through the dark nights and into the hidden rooms where the ancient words are whispered and the ancient sacrifice is offered, and no one outside that small world ever know. The parish register is a book that resides in a wooden chest in the vestry of the church of St. Turch, Mary the Virgin in the village of Littlehampton, and the chest is locked with a heavy iron key that is kept by the church warden, Thomas Brewer, on a ring that hangs from his belt. The chest itself is an old thing, made of dark seasoned oak, that has been polished by the hands of many generations, and it smells of dust and old paper and the faint, dry scent of the herbs that are laid between the pages of the register to keep the moths and the silverfish away. The vestry is a small room that opens off the north side of the chancel, a room that is cold and dim even on the brightest of days, because the single window is small and high and made of the same thick greenish glass that fills the windows of the church itself, glass that lets in light but not clarity, light that is soft and diffuse and seems to come from no particular direction. The floor of the vestry is of stone flags, worn smooth by the feet of vicars and churchwardens and parish clerks who have come and gone over the centuries, and the walls are of the same grey stone as the rest of the church, and they are bare except for a single wooden shelf that holds a few old books and a bundle of quills and a stone bottle of ink. The register itself is a large, heavy volume bound in brown leather that is cracked and worn along the spine, and its pages are of thick, creamy paper that has yellowed gently with age, acquiring the colour of old parchment or of the foam on a mug of ale. The pages are ruled with faint lines of red ink, lines that guide the hand of the parish clerk as he makes his entries, and the entries themselves are written in a variety of hands, some neat and precise, some hurried and careless, some so cramped and crabbed that they are almost impossible to read. The register contains the record of the life of the parish, the baptisms and the marriages and the burials, the names of those who have come into the world, and those who have left it, and those who have joined their lives together in between. It is a book of names, a book of dates, a book of the small, ordinary facts that make up the history of a place and a people. And it is also, in these years, a book of a different kind of record. A record of those who have refused to conform, those who have stayed away from the services of the established church, those whose names are written down not in celebration, but in a kind of quiet, bureaucratic lament. The entries for recusancy are made in a separate section of the register, a section that was added some years ago when the law began to require a more careful accounting of those who absented themselves from divine service. The entries are simple and formulaic, and they follow a pattern that does not vary from week to week or month to month. The date is written first, the day and the month, and the year of our Lord according to the calendar of the Church of England. Then the name of the family or the individual is written, the full name and the place of residence. Then the fact of the absence is noted, in words that are always the same. Did not attend divine service this Sunday last, or absent from morning prayer and sermon, or did not receive the Holy Communion at Easter last. And then, at the end of the entry, a small mark is made to indicate that the fine has been paid, a tick or a cross, or the simple word paid, written in a hand that is growing tired of writing the same word over and over again. If you were to sit in the vestry of St. C. Mary the Virgin on a quiet afternoon, with the grey light falling through the high window and the dust motes drifting slowly in the still air, and if you were to open the register and turn the pages slowly, letting your eye drift down the columns of names and dates and fines, you would see a kind of story unfolding. A story that is not written in sentences or paragraphs, but in the simple, cumulative weight of repetition. The same names appear again and again, week after week, month after month, season after season. The family at the manor house by the river. The elderly widow in the village of Littlehampton, a handful of other names scattered across the parish, names that belong to farmers and tradesmen and labourers, people of modest means who pay their 12 pence every Sunday and say nothing and keep their heads down and hope that the storm will pass. The register does not judge them. The register does not comment on their choices or their beliefs or the quiet desperation that must attend the weekly subtraction of a shilling from a household budget that has no room for subtraction. The register simply records in its calm, bureaucratic way the fact of their absence and the fact of their payment, and it leaves the rest to the silence. But the register is only one part of the machinery of enforcement, and not the heaviest part. The heavier part, the part that falls with a weight that is not measured in shillings or in pence, is the oath. The oath of supremacy, to give it its full and formal title, is a short document, a few lines of text that can be read aloud in less than a minute. And yet those few lines have the power to unmake a life as surely as a sword or a sickness or a fall from a horse. The words of the oath are simple and direct, and they have been crafted by lawyers and bishops and privy councillors to leave no room for ambiguity or evasion, or the small, comfortable fictions that men tell themselves in order to live with their consciences. The person who takes the oath must swear, upon the holy Gospels of God, that the monarch is the only supreme governor of this realm in all spiritual and ecclesiastical things, and that no foreign prince or prelate or potentate has any jurisdiction or authority within these shores. The words are clear, and the meaning is clear, and the consequence of swearing them, for a man or a woman who holds to the old faith, is also clear. To swear the oath is to deny the authority of the Bishop of Rome, the successor of Peter, the visible head of the Church on earth, as they have been taught to believe since they were children at their mother's knee. To swear the oath is to cut oneself off from the unity of the Catholic Church and to place one's soul in a state of mortal peril. And to refuse the oath is to cut oneself off from the life of England, from public office in the professions and the universities, and the simple right to move freely about the country and conduct one's business without the constant grinding weight of suspicion and restriction. The oath is administered in a variety of settings, depending on the station and the circumstances of the person who is required to take it. For a young man who wishes to study at Oxford or Cambridge, the oath is administered in a college hall, with the masters and the fellows looking on and the portraits of past benefactors staring down from the walls. For a man who wishes to practice law or medicine or to hold any public office, the oath is administered in a courtroom or a guild hall, with a magistrate or a judge presiding and a clerk recording the name of the swearer in yet another register. For a man who is suspected of recusancy and who has been summoned before the justices of the peace, the oath is administered in a small panelled room in a country house, with the fire crackling in the hearth and the rain beating against the windows and the faces of the justices looking at him with a mixture of impatience and curiosity and sometimes a faint flickering sympathy that is quickly suppressed. The sound of the oath being administered is a sound that follows a particular rhythm, a rhythm that is familiar to anyone who has spent time in the courts and the guild halls and the chambers of the realm. The magistrate or the clerk reads the words of the oath aloud, slowly and clearly, pausing after each phrase to allow the swearer to repeat them. The swearer places his right hand upon a Bible, a heavy, leather-bound volume that is open to a page of the Gospels, and he looks at the printed words without seeing them, and he repeats the words of the oath in a voice that is steady or trembling or flat and expressionless, depending on the state of his heart. The sound of the voice repeating the words is a small sound, a sound that is swallowed up by the greater sounds of the room and the weather and the ordinary noise of the world, and yet it is a sound that echoes in the memory of the swearer for the rest of his life. The words once spoken cannot be unspoken. The act once done cannot be undone. The hand that has touched the Bible in oath is a hand that has made a bond with the state, a bond that is legal and public and irrevocable. For those who cannot swear the oath, there is a different sound, a sound that is even smaller and quieter than the sound of the words being repeated. It is the sound of a refusal, a sound that is often no more than a single word, spoken softly and clearly and with a kind of sad, resigned finality. No. The word hangs in the air of the room for a moment, and then it is absorbed by the silence, and the silence stretches out and becomes a thing of weight and substance, a thing that presses down upon everyone present. The magistrate looks up from his papers, and his pen pauses in its scratching, and he regards the refuser with a look that is not angry, but simply tired. The look of a man who has seen this scene played out too many times and who knows exactly what must follow. The clerk makes a note in the margin of the register, a small mark that indicates a refusal, and that mark is a door that closes, a door that shuts off a future that might have been. The young man who refuses the oath at the university will not receive his degree, will not enter the professions, will not take his place among the educated and the influential and the comfortable of the land. The man who refuses the oath before the justices will have his name entered in a different kind of register, a register of those who are known to be disaffected and disloyal and who must be watched with a particular care. His movements will be restricted, his property will be surveyed, his children will be questioned, and the slow, steady pressure of the law will bear down upon him with a weight that is all the heavier for being quiet and bureaucratic and utterly without malice. In the manor house by the river, the master of the house has refused the oath. He refused it many years ago, when he was a young man newly come into his inheritance and full of hope for the future. He stood in a panelled room in the house of a local justice, with the rain falling on the roof and the fire smoking in the hearth and the Bible open before him. And he listened to the words of the oath being read aloud, and he looked at the faces of the men who were watching him, and he said the single word that changed the course of his life. He said it quietly, without drama or defiance, in the same tone of voice he might have used to decline a second helping of pudding, or to refuse a cup of wine when he had had enough. No. And the justice nodded, and the clerk made his mark, and the master of the house walked out of the room and into the rain, and rode home to his manor, and his fields, and his quiet, restricted future. He has never held public office. He has never served as a justice of the peace, or a member of Parliament, or even a churchwarden in his own parish. He has never sent his sons to the university, because they would be required to take the oath before they could matriculate, and he cannot ask them to swear what he himself cannot swear. His world has shrunk to the boundaries of his own estate, the fields and the woods and the river and the house with the hidden room at the end of the hallway, and he has learned to live within those boundaries and to find what peace he can in the small, ordinary rhythms of the days and the seasons. His wife has also refused the oath, though she has never been formally required to take it. The law does not press the oath upon women with the same insistence that it presses it upon men, because women do not hold public office and do not attend the universities and do not, in the ordinary course of things, pose the same threat to the established order. But the wife knows that if she were asked, she would refuse, and she knows that her refusal would bring the same consequences, the same slow, grinding restrictions, the same quiet, invisible walls that close in around a life and make it smaller and smaller, until there is nothing left but the house and the family and the hidden room and the whispered prayers. She has accepted this. She has accepted it, as she has accepted the weight of the fines and the secrecy of the Mass and the constant, low-grade fear that attends every knock on the door and every unfamiliar face on the road. She has accepted it because she believes, with a quiet, unshakable certainty, that the things she would lose by swearing the oath are greater than the things she has lost by refusing it. She believes that her soul and the souls of her husband and her children are worth more than a seat in Parliament, or a degree from Oxford, or the freedom to travel where she will without a license. This belief is the bedrock of her life, the foundation upon which everything else is built, and she does not speak of it often because it is too deep and too fundamental to be put into words. The children of the house have not yet been asked to take the oath. They are too young, but the shadow of the oath falls upon them even so, shaping their futures in ways that they are only beginning to understand. The eldest son, a boy of 17, with his father's calm eyes and his mother's quiet manner, has a sharp mind and a hunger for learning. He reads every book he can find, and he asks questions about the world beyond the boundaries of the estate, and he dreams, in the way that young men dream, of travelling to London and seeing the great city and studying at the Inns of Court and making a name for himself in the wider world. But he knows, because his father has told him gently and without bitterness, that these dreams are not for him. He cannot go to London, except with a license and for a specified purpose and for a limited time. He cannot study at the Inns of Court, because he would be required to take the oath before he could begin his studies. He cannot make a name for himself in the wider world, because the wider world is closed to him, barred by a few lines of text and a single word that his father spoke in a panelled room many years ago. The boy accepts this, as his parents have accepted it, with a quiet resignation that is both sad and strangely peaceful. He turns his mind to the things that are within his reach: the management of the estate, the care of the land, the quiet, hidden practice of the faith that has cost his family so much. He learns to find satisfaction in the small things: the health of the sheep and the quality of the harvest and the sound of the Latin Mass whispered in the hidden room. He learns to live within the walls that have been built around him, and he learns not to look too long or too hard at the gaps in those walls where the light of the forbidden world shines through. The register and the oath are two parts of the same machine, a machine that is designed to produce a single result: conformity. The register records the names of those who do not conform, and it tallies the fines they pay, and it provides a record that can be consulted by the authorities whenever they wish to know who is loyal and who is suspect. The oath is the gate that separates the conforming from the non-conforming, the loyal from the suspect, the full citizens of the realm from those who are merely tolerated, barely and grudgingly, within its borders. The machine works slowly and steadily, and it does not need to be violent to be effective. It only needs to be patient, to keep its records and administer its oaths and impose its small cumulative burdens year after year, generation after generation, until the will to resist is worn away and the old faith is nothing more than a memory, a story told by old people to children who do not understand. But in the manor house by the river, the will to resist has not been worn away. The register still records the weekly fine, and the oath has still not been sworn, and the hidden room at the end of the hallway still holds its small, secret congregation. The sound of the church bell on a Sunday morning still carries across the fields, and the family still stays home, and the servant still delivers the shilling to the church warden's door on Monday morning. The machine turns, and the family endures, and the years pass and nothing changes except the slow, steady accumulation of small losses and small griefs and small quiet victories that no one outside the house will ever know or celebrate. The register will continue to record the names, and the oath will continue to be refused, and the life of the house will continue in its narrow, hidden, carefully tended groove. A life that is lived in the shadow of a few lines of text and a single, softly spoken word. The sound of water on stone is a sound that belongs to a different world, a world that is far from the grey skies and the soft rain and the quiet, watchful roads of England. It is the sound of a fountain in a courtyard that is enclosed on four sides by the warm, honey-coloured walls of a college that stands in a town whose name is spoken in whispers in the hidden rooms of English manor houses. The town is Douai, or sometimes it is Rome, or Valladolid, or Seville, or any one of the half-dozen places on the continent where the English have established their seminaries, their houses of study, their training grounds for the men who will one day return to the land of their birth and walk its dangerous roads and say its forbidden masses and, in many cases, meet their end upon a scaffold at Tyburn or York or Lancaster. The courtyard is a place of quiet and of order, a place where the sun falls with a warmth and a clarity that is rare and precious to men who have grown up under the perpetual soft grey blanket of English cloud. The fountain stands in the centre of the courtyard, a simple stone basin with a jet of water that rises from a pipe in the middle and falls back upon itself with a sound that is continuous and gentle and entirely without urgency, a sound that fills the air and washes against the walls and seeps into the stones and becomes, after a time, so familiar that it is no longer heard as a separate thing, but is simply the background against which all other sounds are measured. The men who walk in this courtyard are young men, most of them, though there are older men among them as well. Men who have come to their vocation later in life, or who have been delayed by the difficulties of travel and the dangers of the journey from England. They walk slowly, in pairs or in small groups, or they sit on the stone benches that are placed against the warm walls, and they read from small books, or they talk in low voices, or they simply sit and look at the fountain and listen to the sound of the water, and think about the fountain, and listen to the sound of the water, and think about the things that they do not speak of aloud. Their clothes are the clothes of students and of scholars, plain black gowns over plain black doublets, and their heads are bare or covered with the simple black caps of the seminarian. There is no need for disguise here, no need for the grey wool and the brown linen and the careful studied ordinariness of the English road. Here, in this courtyard, surrounded by walls that are friendly and by men who share the same faith and the same purpose, they can be what they are. Young men who are preparing to become priests, to return to a country where their very existence is a crime, and to live out their lives in the shadow of the rope and the knife. The routine of the college is a routine of order and of repetition, a routine that is designed to shape the mind and the soul and the body into a single unified instrument for the work that lies ahead. The day begins early, before the sun has fully cleared the rooftops of the town, with the sound of a bell that is smaller and softer than the great bells of the English parish churches, a bell that calls the students to the chapel for the first prayers of the day. The chapel is a long, narrow room with a high ceiling and windows of clear glass that let in the pale morning light, and the walls are whitewashed and bare, except for a single crucifix that hangs above the altar. The students file in and take their places in the wooden stalls that line the walls, and they kneel on the hard stone floor, and they pray. The prayers are in Latin, the ancient language of the Church, the language that has been spoken in these rites for 1,000 years and more. And the sound of the Latin rising and falling in the still air of the chapel is a sound that is both familiar and strange to the English ears of the students. It is familiar because it is the language of their childhood, the language of the masses they heard in secret rooms and the prayers they learned at their mother's knee. It is strange because it is spoken here openly, without fear, without the need for whispers and hidden rooms and drawn curtains. Here, in this chapel, the Latin rises freely to the high ceiling and fills the space with its ancient sonorous rhythms, and no one listens at the door, and no one listens at the door, and no one watches from the road, and no one records the names of those who attend. After the prayers comes the study. The students spend many hours of each day in the library or in their small plain rooms, bent over books of theology and philosophy and scripture, learning the intricate, careful arguments of the church fathers and the schoolmen, tracing the fine distinctions of doctrine that separate the true faith from the errors of the reformers. The work is slow and painstaking, and it requires a patience that does not come naturally to young men who are full of zeal and longing, and the desire to be doing rather than studying. They learn to pass the dense Latin of Thomas Aquinas, to follow the winding arguments of Augustine, to memorize the decrees of the Council of Trent and the catechism that has been prepared to instruct the faithful in the true doctrine. They learn to answer the objections of the Protestants, to refute the arguments of Cranmer and Ridley and the other architects of the English schism, to defend the Mass and the sacraments and the authority of the Pope with a clarity and a precision that will be needed when they stand before the justices and the pursuivants and the hostile questioners of their own country. The sound of the study is a low, continuous murmur, the turning of pages and the scratching of quills and the soft, rhythmic drone of voices reciting Latin verbs and theological propositions, a sound that blends with the sound of the fountain in the courtyard and the distant noise of the town beyond the walls. The verbs are the heart of the Latin tongue, and the students spend many hours declining and conjugating, committing to memory the endless variations of tense and mood and voice that give the language its precision and its beauty. Amo, amas, amat, amamus, amatis, amant, amamus, amatis, the present tense of love, a word that is simple and profound and that contains within it the whole of the Christian mystery. Amabam, amabas, amabat, amabas, amabat, amabamus, amabatis, the imperfect tense, the tense of ongoing action in the past, the tense of a love that was and is and will be, a love that does not end. Amavi, amavisti, 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 amavistis, amavistis, the perfect tense, the tense of completed action, the tense of a love that has been accomplished, a love that was shown upon the cross and in the resurrection, and that is made present again upon the altar at every Mass. The students repeat these forms until they are worn smooth and familiar, until the sounds of the words are as natural as breathing, until the language of the Church becomes a second tongue that sits alongside their native English and that will sustain them in the years to come. The teachers who guide the students in this work are men who have themselves made the journey from England, or men who were born in exile and who have never seen the green fields and the grey skies of the land their parents left behind. They are patient men, for the most part, men who understand the weight that their students carry and the future that awaits them. They do not speak often of the dangers of the mission because the dangers of the new to all and need no elaboration. They speak instead of the work, of the souls that will be entrusted to their care, of the sacraments that they will administer in secret rooms and hidden chapels, of the comfort and the strength that they will bring to a people who have been deprived of the consolations of their faith. The teachers speak in calm, measured voices, and they look at their students with eyes that have seen much and that betray little, and they prepare them not only with knowledge, but with a certain quality of stillness, a certain inner quiet that will be their greatest protection in the years ahead. In the afternoons, when the heat of the day is at its peak and the sun falls straight down into the courtyard and makes the stones shimmer with a faint, wavering haze, the students are given time for rest and for reflection. They walk in the courtyard, their footsteps slow and measured on the warm stones, and they listen to the sound of the fountain, and they think about the country they have left behind. They think about the grey skies and the soft rain and the green hills and the small hidden rooms where the faithful gather to hear the Mass. They think about their families, their mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters who are living under the weight of the fines and the restrictions and the constant, low-grade fear of discovery. They think about the priests who came before them, the men whose names are recorded in the small black books that sit on the shelves of recusant households, the men who were captured and imprisoned and tortured and executed, whose heads were set upon spikes on London Bridge, and whose quarters were boiled in salt and displayed on the gates of the city. They think about these things not with fear, or not only with fear, but with a quiet, deliberate acceptance, a slow, steady settling of the soul into the shape of the future that has been chosen for them. This acceptance is a kind of training in itself, a training that is as important as the Latin verbs and the theological arguments, because a man who is afraid cannot do the work that is required of him, and a man who has accepted his fate can walk calmly into the darkness and do what must be done. The sound of the water on the stone is a sound that speaks of this acceptance. The water rises from the pipe and falls back into the basin, and it does not resist the falling or the rising. It simply moves, following the shape of the stone and the pull of the earth, doing what water does, and in its doing it wears the stone smooth and round and patient. The students who listen to this sound, day after day, month after month, year after year, begin to take on something of its quality. They learn to move with the shape of their circumstances, to accept the pull of their vocation, to wear away the rough edges of their fear and their ambition and their longing for a different kind of life. They learn to be patient, to wait for the moment when they will be sent, to trust that the work will be given to them when they are ready, and not before. The sound of the water is a sound of time passing, a sound of slow, steady, inexorable change, and it measures out the days and the months and the years of their preparation without hurry and without pause. In the evenings, after the study and the prayer and the simple meal that is taken in silence in the refectory, the students gather again in the chapel for the final office of the day. The light has faded from the high windows, and the chapel is lit by candles that flicker and dance in the draughts, casting long, wavering shadows on the whitewashed walls. The voices of the students rise in the ancient chant of Compline, the prayer that closes the day and commends the soul to God's keeping through the hours of darkness. The Latin of the Psalms is familiar now, warm smooth by repetition, and the sound of it fills the chapel and spills out into the courtyard and mingles with the sound of the fountain and rises up into the darkening sky. Fratres, sobriae istote et vigilate, quia adversarius vista, diabolus tamquam leo rugiens circit, querens cem devoret. Brethren, be sober and watchful. For your adversary the devil goes about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. The words are ancient, and they speak of a danger that is spiritual and eternal. But for these young men, they carry a second, more immediate meaning. The lion that seeks to devour them wears not only the shape of the devil, but also the shape of the pursuivant and the constable and the magistrate, the shape of the rack and the rope and the knife. And yet they sing the words calmly, without trembling, because they have learned to accept the lion as a part of the landscape through which they must walk. The night comes, and the students retire to their small plain rooms, and the college settles into silence. The fountain continues to play in the courtyard, its sound a soft, continuous presence in the darkness, and the stars come out in the clear sky above the warm, honey-colored walls. In one of those small rooms, a young man from England kneels beside his narrow bed and says his private prayers, and he thinks about the road that lies ahead. He thinks about the port where he will embark, the ship that will carry him across the narrow sea, the landing on the English coast, and the long journey inland to the safe house that has been prepared for him. He thinks about the clothes he will wear, the grey wool and the brown linen, the doublet and the jerkin and the cloak, the disguise that will make him look like any other traveller on the road. He thinks about the hidden room where he will say his first Mass, the small congregation of faithful souls who will kneel on the packed earth floor and receive the sacrament from his hands. He thinks about the knock on the door that may come at any moment, the sound of boots on the stair, the faces of the men who have come to take him away. He thinks about all of these things, and he feels the fear rise in his throat like a cold, sour taste, and then he breathes slowly and lets the fear settle, lets it sink down into the quiet acceptance that he has learned in this courtyard under this sky, to the sound of water falling on stone. The fear does not disappear, but it ceases to matter. It becomes a part of the landscape, like the lion and the rope and the long, dangerous road. And he learns to walk through it as he has learned to walk through everything else. The years pass in the college, and the young man grows older, and the day comes when he is called to the rector's study and told that his time of preparation is complete. He will be ordained a priest, and then he will be sent. The ordination takes place in the chapel, on a morning that is no different from any other morning, with the light falling through the clear windows and the sound of the fountain drifting in from the courtyard. The young man kneels before the bishop, and the bishop lays his hands upon his head, and the ancient words are spoken, and the young man rises as a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. His hands, which have held books and quills and the rough wood of the choir stall, are now the hands that will hold the body and blood of Christ. His voice, which has recited Latin verbs and theological arguments, is now the voice that will speak the words of consecration and absolution. He is the same man he was an hour ago, and he is utterly changed. The day of his departure arrives, and he stands in the courtyard for the last time, listening to the sound of the fountain. He will carry this sound with him, he knows, into the grey silence of England, into the hidden rooms and the secret masses and the long, dangerous roads. The sound of water on stone will be a memory of this place, this warm, safe, ordered world where he learned to be what he has become. He turns away from the fountain and walks through the gate and out into the street, and he does not look back. The road to the coast is long, and the ship is waiting. And beyond the ship lies England, and beyond England lies whatever God has prepared for him. He walks with a steady, unhurried pace, the pace of a man who has learned to accept the shape of his life, and the sound of his footsteps on the cobblestones is a small, quiet sound that is soon swallowed up by the noise of the town and the cry of the gulls and the distant murmur of the sea. The long gallery is a room that exists for no particular purpose, a room that was built by some ancestor in a time when it was fashionable for manor houses to have such spaces, long and narrow and lined with windows, where one might walk for exercise when the weather was too foul to venture outside, or where one might display a collection of paintings or tapestries or suits of armour to impress a visiting neighbour. The gallery in the manor house by the river is not so grand as some, not so long or so high or so richly appointed, but it serves its purpose well enough. It runs the entire length of the upper floor of the oldest part of the house, from the top of the main staircase at one end to a small, round window that looks out over the orchard at the other. The floor is of broad oak boards, the same dark honeyed wood as the panelling in the hallway below, and these boards have been worn smooth by the feet of many generations walking back and forth, in the slow, meditative rhythm of those who have nowhere particular to go, and all the time in the world to get there. The walls are plastered and painted with a lime wash that has mellowed to a soft, creamy colour, and along one wall there is a series of windows that look out over the fields and the river and the distant grey-green line of the hills. The windows are tall and narrow, divided into many small panes of glass by thin strips of lead, and the glass itself is old and imperfect, full of small bubbles and ripples that distort the view and give the landscape beyond a soft, wavering, dreamlike quality, as if the whole world outside were under water. The furniture in the long gallery is sparse and simple. There are a few old chairs placed here and there, chairs with high, straight backs and seats of warm velvet that has faded from some original rich color to a soft, indeterminate brown. There is a small table near the center of the room, and on the table there is a candlestick of tarnished brass and a book that no one reads anymore, a book of devotional poetry that belonged to a great-aunt long dead. There is a single tapestry hanging on the wall opposite the windows, a tapestry that depicts a scene of hunting with hounds and horses and men in old-fashioned clothes pursuing a stag through a forest of dark green and brown. The tapestry is faded and threadbare in places, and the faces of the hunters are worn smooth and featureless, so that they seem less like individual men and more like the idea of men, the memory of a memory. The room smells of dust and old wood, and the faint sweet scent of the beeswax that is used to polish the floorboards once a year, in the spring, when the windows are opened for the first time after the long winter, and the fresh air floods in and stirs the motes of dust into slow, swirling dances in the shafts of pale sunlight. It is in this room that the family walks. They walk because there is nowhere else to walk, or rather because the places where they might walk are limited by the invisible walls of the law and the visible walls of prudence. The fields and the lanes and the paths along the river are open to them, in theory, but to walk too freely in those places is to invite attention, to be seen and noted and wondered about. A recusant who walks abroad too often, who seems to have no pressing business but simply wanders for the pleasure of it, is a recusant who might be going to meet someone, or to visit a hidden chapel, or to carry a message from one safe house to another. And so the family walks in the long gallery, back and forth, from the top of the stairs to the round window that overlooks the orchard and back again. The walk is not long, perhaps 40 paces from end to end, and it is a walk that requires no thought and no attention, a walk that the feet know so well that they could perform it in the dark, and sometimes do, when the night is too long, and sleep will not come, and there is nothing to do but move through the quiet house and listen to the sound of one's own footsteps on the old, familiar boards. The passing of the years in the long gallery is a thing that is felt rather than observed, a slow, cumulative change that is too gradual to be noticed from one day to the next, but that becomes undeniable when one looks back across the span of a decade or more. The light that falls through the tall windows changes with the seasons, as it does everywhere, but in the long gallery, the change is the only marker of time's passage in a life that has become otherwise still. In the spring, the light is soft and green, filtered through the new leaves on the trees that stand between the house and the river, and it falls upon the floorboards in shifting, dappled patterns that move with the breeze and the sun. In the summer, the light is stronger and warmer, a golden light that fills the room and makes the dust motes shine like tiny stars and draws out the faint sweet smell of the old wood and the old wax. In the autumn, the light takes on a russet quality, a deep, rich gold that is tinged with red and brown, the colors of the leaves that are turning and falling in the world beyond the windows. And in the winter, the light is thin and grey and pale, a light that seems to carry no warmth at all, a light that barely penetrates the small leaded panes and that leaves the far corners of the gallery in a perpetual, gentle dusk. The children of the house grow up in this room, and they grow old in this room, and they watch the light change through the seasons and the years, and they learn to measure their lives not by the great events of the outside world, but by the small, quiet rhythms of the outside world, but by the small, quiet rhythms of the house and the family and the faith. The eldest son, the boy who dreamed of London and the Inns of Court, walks the gallery now as a man of 30, his hair beginning to thin at the temples, and his shoulders slightly stooped from the weight of the life he has accepted. He did not go to London. He did not study the law. He stayed at home and learned to manage the estate and to keep the accounts and to pay the fines and to say the prayers in the hidden room at the end of the hallway. He married a quiet, capable woman from another recusant family, a family that lives 3 counties away, and that he sees only rarely, when the licenses for travel can be obtained and the journeys can be made without attracting too much notice. They have children of their own now, small figures who run unsteadily down the length of the long gallery and who press their faces against the rippled glass of the windows, and who ask in their high, clear voices why they cannot go outside and play in the fields like the other children they see from the window. The questions are answered gently, with words that are true but not complete, and the children learn, as their father learned before them, that there are things in the world that cannot be fully explained and that must simply be accepted. The daughters of the house walk the gallery as well, their footsteps lighter and quicker than the footsteps of the men, their voices a soft, continuous murmur as they talk of the small things that fill their days. They talk of the garden and the still room and the preserving of fruits and the making of simples and remedies from the herbs that grow in the sheltered plot behind the kitchen. They talk of the clothes they will sew for the winter, and the patterns they will use, and the stitches they have learned from their mother. They talk of the families in the neighborhood, the conforming families who attend the church and whose lives seem, from a distance, to be so much easier and so much freer than their own. They do not speak of this with bitterness or envy, or not often, but simply as a fact, a condition of the world like the weather or the turning of the seasons. They know that they will not marry the sons of those families because the sons of conforming families do not marry the daughters of recusants. Not if they wish to keep their land and their standing and their freedom from the fines and the restrictions. They know that they will marry, if they marry at all, into one of the other recusant families. Families they have never met and may never meet until the contracts are signed and the licenses obtained and the long, careful journeys made. This knowledge sits quietly in the back of their minds, a shadow that does not darken the present but that shapes the future into a narrow, predetermined channel. The mother of the house walks the gallery more slowly than the others, her steps careful and deliberate, her hand sometimes resting on the back of a chair or the edge of the table for support. She is older now, her hair more grey than brown, her face lined with the fine, soft wrinkles of a life lived mostly indoors and mostly in a state of quiet, constant vigilance. She has spent more than 30 years in this house, walking this gallery and looking out these windows and watching the light change through the seasons and the years. She remembers when she first came here as a young bride, full of hope and fear in equal measure, and she remembers how strange and narrow the life seemed to her then, how she longed for the wider world she had left behind. But the years have worn away the sharp edges of that longing, as the water in the fountain wears away the stone, and she has learned to find a kind of peace in the narrowness, a kind of freedom in the restriction. The walls that close her in are also the walls that keep the world out, and within those walls she has built a life that is small but complete, a life of prayer and work and family, and the slow, steady practice of a faith that has cost her everything and given her everything in return. She walks to the end of the gallery and looks out the round window at the orchard below, at the bare branches of the apple trees and the grey winter grass and the high pale sky, and she does not wish for anything that lies beyond that window. She has learned not to wish. The years pass, and the light continues to change, and the family continues to walk, and the world outside the windows continues on its own course, a course that seems, from the quiet of the long gallery, to be very far away and to have very little to do with the life that is lived within these walls. The Queen dies, and a king takes her place, a king who is the son of a Catholic mother and who is said to be more tolerant of the old faith. There is a stirring of hope in the hidden rooms of England, a whispered speculation that the fines might be reduced, or the laws relaxed, or the oath no longer required. But the hope fades, as hope so often does, and the king proves to be as firm in his Protestantism as his predecessor, and the laws remain in place, and the fines continue to be paid, and the family continue to be paid, and the family continues to walk in the long gallery. The king dies in turn, and his son takes the throne, and there is war and turmoil, and the brief, strange interlude of the Commonwealth, when the Church of England itself is suppressed, and the Book of Common Prayer is banned, and the whole machinery of enforced conformity is thrown into disarray. For a time in those strange years, the recusant families find themselves in an odd, unexpected position. No longer the most hunted of the dissenting sects, but simply one among many, and the pressure eases a little, and the pursuivants have other business to attend to. But the family in the manor house by the river does not change its ways. They have learned to be cautious over many generations, and caution is a habit that is not easily broken. They continue to pay what fines are demanded, and to keep their heads down, and to walk in the long gallery, and to say their prayers in the hidden room. The Commonwealth ends, and the king returns, and the old order is restored, and the Church of England rises again to its place of supremacy, and the fines and the restrictions and the oaths return with it. The family in the manor house has seen it all before. They have seen hope rise and fall, seen kings come and go, seen the laws tighten and loosen and tighten again. They have learned that the only constant is the quiet, hidden life they have built for themselves, the life of the house and the family and the faith, the life that is measured out in the slow pacing of the long gallery and the changing of the light through the tall, narrow windows. The children who once ran unsteadily down the length of the gallery are grown now, and they have children of their own, and the cycle repeats itself. The new children learn to walk in the gallery, and they press their faces to the rippled glass, and they ask why they cannot go outside and play in the fields. The questions are answered with the same gentle, incomplete words, and the children learn, as their parents learned and their grandparents learned before them, to accept the narrowness of their world, and to find what joy they can within its boundaries. The light falls through the windows, spring and summer and autumn and winter, and the dust motes dance in the shafts of pale sun, and the floorboards creak under the slow, steady tread of the walkers, and the years pass, and nothing changes except the faces of those who walk, and the color of the hair, and the depth of the lines around the eyes. And yet even in this stillness there is a kind of movement, a kind of slow, inexorable drift toward a future that no one in the house can foresee. The world outside the windows is changing, though the changes are too gradual to be noticed from within the long gallery. The ideas that once seemed fixed and eternal, the ideas of religious uniformity and the divine right of kings and the necessity of a single, state-enforced church, are beginning to erode, worn away by the same slow, patient forces that wear away the stone. New voices are being raised, voices that speak of toleration and liberty of conscience and the rights of the individual to worship according to the dictates of his own heart. These voices are still faint and distant, heard only in the great cities and the universities and the houses of a few forward-thinking nobles, and they have not yet reached the quiet countryside where the family walks in the long gallery. But they are growing louder, and the day will come when they can no longer be ignored. The family does not know this. They know only the sound of their own footsteps on the old oak boards, and the sight of the light changing through the seasons, and the weight of the fine and the silence of the hidden room, and the long, slow, patient work of enduring. They do not hope for change, because hope is a thing that can break a heart, and they have learned to protect their hearts by not hoping. They simply continue, day after day, and year after year, and generation after generation, walking the length of the long gallery and back again, watching the light and the seasons and the faces of their children, and waiting for nothing in particular except the end of the day and the beginning of the next, and the quiet, steady rhythm of a life that has been reduced to its simplest, most essential elements. The hardship is not over, and it may never be over, but it has become so familiar that it is no longer felt as hardship. It is simply the texture of existence. The grain of the wood and the ripple of the glass and the soft grey light of an English afternoon falling on the worn boards of the floor, and it is enough. The change, when it comes, does not come with a clap of thunder or a blast of trumpets or a sudden dramatic reversal of fortune. It comes slowly, in the way that the tide comes in on a flat, sandy shore, a thin, silvery sheet of water advancing inch by inch across the damp sand, so gradual that the eye cannot detect its movement, and yet so inexorable that within an hour the whole landscape has been transformed. The year is 1688, or it is 1689, or it is some year in that quiet, misty borderland between the old world and the new, and the news that travels along the roads and the lanes and the byways of England is news of a kind that has not been heard before. A king has fled, and another king has come, and with the new king has come a new way of thinking about the old, bitter questions of faith and conscience and the right of the state to command the souls of its subjects. The new king is a Protestant, but he is a Protestant of a different temper, a man who has seen enough of religious wars and religious persecutions on the continent to have developed a certain weariness with the whole business, a certain inclination to let men worship as they will, so long as they do not disturb the public peace. And so there is talk, at first only a whisper, and then a murmur, and then a quiet, matter-of-fact acceptance of a new law, a law that will change everything and nothing, a law called the Toleration Act. The Act is a short document, as these things go, a few pages of dense, legal prose that can be read aloud in less than an hour, and yet those few pages contain within them the seeds of a world that is different from the world that has been. The Act does not repeal the old laws, not in so many words. The fines for recusancy remain on the books, and the oaths of supremacy and allegiance remain on the books, and the requirement to attend the services of the established church remains on the books. But the Act says in its quiet legal way that these laws will no longer be enforced against those who dissent from the established church, in good conscience, those who take a new, simpler oath of allegiance to the crown, and who register their places of worship with the authorities, and who keep their doors unlocked and their meetings open to the public view. The Act does not speak of Catholics by name, not at first, but the meaning is clear enough to those who know how to read the language of the law. The long, slow grinding of the machine is to be halted, or at least slowed to a stop, and the weight that has pressed down upon the recusant families for so many generations is to be lifted, not all at once and not entirely, but enough to allow a deep breath to be drawn, enough to allow a deep breath to be drawn, enough to allow a door to be left ajar. In the manor house by the river, the news arrives in the person of the church warden, Thomas Brewer, who is now a very old man with a fringe of white hair and a face that is seamed and weathered like the bark of an ancient oak. He comes to the house on a morning in the late spring, walking slowly up the lane with the aid of a stick, and he knocks on the front door with the same soft, diffident knock that he has used for all the years of his office. The servant who opens the door knows him well, and she shows him into the small parlour where the family takes its meals, and she brings him a cup of small beer and a slice of bread and cheese, and she goes to fetch the master of the house. The master comes, a man in his middle years now, with his father's calm eyes and his mother's quiet manner, and he sits down across from the churchwarden and waits to hear what business has brought him. The churchwarden is silent for a long moment, turning his cup in his hands and looking at the table and the window and the green wool curtain that still hangs over the glass. Then he speaks, and his voice is slow and careful, the voice of a man who is delivering news that he himself does not fully understand. He tells the master of the house about the Toleration Act, about the new oath that may be taken in place of the old oath of supremacy, about the provision for registering a place of worship and holding services without fear of prosecution. He tells him that the fines will no longer be collected, that the names will no longer be recorded in the parish register, that the pursuivants will no longer ride the roads looking for signs of secret gatherings. He tells him that the law is not repealed, that the old statutes are still there in the books, and could, in theory, be enforced again if the winds of politics should shift, but that for now, for the foreseeable future, the pressure is off. The churchwarden says all of this in a flat, toneless voice, as if he is reciting a lesson he has learned by heart. And when he is finished, he falls silent and looks at the master of the house with eyes that are old and tired and full of a strange, unspoken sadness. The sadness of a man who has spent his life enforcing a law that is now revealed to have been unnecessary, a cruelty that served no purpose but its own perpetuation. The master of the house listens to this news without moving, without changing the expression on his face. He has learned, over the course of his life, to receive news with a still countenance, to hold his reactions close and private, and not to let them show. But inside him, in the deep, quiet places where the weight of his life has been carried for so long, something shifts. It is a small shift, a tiny movement, like the settling of a stone in a wall, and he does not know whether it is relief or grief or simply the strange, unfamiliar sensation of a burden being removed. He thanks the churchwarden for coming, and he sees him to the door, and he watches the old man walk slowly back down the lane toward the village, leaning on his stick and pausing once to look back at the house with an expression that is impossible to read. Then he closes the door and walks back into the hallway and stands for a long time looking at the panelled wall at the end, the wall with the carved Tudor rose and the hidden door that leads to the hidden room. The door is left ajar, not literally, not at first, because the habit of secrecy is too deeply ingrained to be broken in a single day or a single year. The panel is still closed, and the dust is still swept carefully across the threshold, and the green wool curtain still hangs over the window in the parlour. But something has changed in the quality of the silence, something that is felt rather than heard, the fear that has lived in the house for so many generations, the low, constant hum of vigilance that has been the background music of every life lived within these walls, begins to fade. It does not disappear all at once. It fades slowly, like the sound of a bell that has been struck and then left to resonate, the vibrations growing softer and softer until they are no longer audible, until the only sound is the sound of the wind in the trees and the river running over its stones, and the ordinary peaceful noises of a house at rest. The family does not speak of the change, not at first. They have learned over many generations not to speak of the things that matter most, to keep their hopes and their fears and their deepest thoughts locked away in the same hidden room where they keep their faith. But the change makes itself known in small, unremarkable ways. The savant who delivers the fine money to the churchwarden's door on Monday mornings is told that there is no need to go this week, or the next, or the week after that. The coins that would have been sent to the exchequer are kept in the strong box, and they accumulate slowly, a small quiet surplus that can be used for other things, a new cloak for the eldest daughter, a book for the son who loves to read, a few yards of good linen for the making of shirts and shifts. The master of the house finds himself walking in the fields more often, taking the long path along the river that he has avoided for so many years because it was too exposed and too visible from the road. He walks slowly, with his hands clasped behind his back and his head lifted to the grey sky, and he breathes the damp, earthy air of the English countryside, and he feels, for the first time in his life, that he is not being watched. The children of the house, the new generation that is growing up in this strange transitional time, feel the change most keenly because they have less to unlearn. They are told that they may play in the fields now, that they may walk to the village and speak to the other children and do the ordinary things that children have always done. They receive this news with a kind of cautious wonder, a hesitation that is born of all the whispered warnings and the drawn curtains and the quiet, urgent commands to stay away from the windows. They venture out slowly, in small groups, staying close to the house at first, and then wandering further as their confidence grows. They discover the river and the woods and the wide open spaces of the fields, and they run and shout and laugh with a freedom that their parents and their grandparents never knew. The sound of their laughter carries across the fields and reaches the ears of the older members of the family, and it is a sound that is both beautiful and strange, a sound that belongs to a world that was lost and is now, slowly and tentatively, being found again. The mother of the house, the quiet woman who married the master so many years ago, walks in the long gallery as she has always walked. But her steps are lighter now, and she pauses more often at the windows to look out at the view. She watches her children playing in the orchard, and she watches her husband walking along the river path, and she feels a sensation that she cannot name, a loosening in her chest, a softening of the tight, hard knot that has lived there for as long as she can remember. She thinks about the hidden room at the end of the hallway, the room where she has knelt and prayed and received the sacraments for all the years of her married life, and she wonders if there will come a time when the room is no longer needed, when the faith can be practiced openly and without fear. The thought is strange and unfamiliar, and she does not know whether to welcome it or to mourn the loss of the secret, intimate world that she has known. She only knows that something has shifted, that the walls of her life have moved outward by a few inches, and that the space that has been opened is filled with a light that is soft and grey and full of possibility. The years pass, and the toleration holds, and the habits of a lifetime begin, very slowly, to loosen their grip. The family still says the Mass in the hidden room, because the old church in the village is still the church of the established faith, and the new chapels that are being built in the towns are still a long journey away, and require licenses and registrations that feel strange and public and exposed. But the Mass is said with a little less whispering, a little less fear of the knock on the door, a little more of the ancient sonorous beauty of the Latin words allowed to rise and fill the small stone chamber. The priest who comes to say the Mass comes more openly now, riding up the lane in broad daylight and entering through the front door rather than slipping through the back gate in the dark of night. He still wears the clothes of an ordinary Englishman because the old laws are still on the books, and a priest's cassock would still draw unwanted attention, but he wears them with a different air, a certain ease and confidence that speaks of a world that is changing, slowly and imperfectly, but changing nonetheless. And then one day, a day that is no different from any other day in its outward particulars, The master of the house walks to the end of the hallway and stands before the panelled wall with the carved Tudor rose. He stands there for a long time, looking at the wood in the carving and the small smooth knot that his fingers know so well. He does not press the knot or slide the panel to the left. He simply stands and looks, and he thinks about all the years that this wall has been a door to a hidden world, a world of whispered prayers and secret sacraments, and the constant quiet fear of discovery. He thinks about his father and his grandfather and all the generations before them, the men and women who knelt in that small damp room and said the words that kept their faith alive through the long dark years of the penal times. He thinks about the ledger, and the fine and the oath, and the pursuivant on his brown horse, and he thinks about the sound of the church bell on a Sunday morning, and the green wool curtain drawn tight across the window. And then he turns away from the wall and walks back down the hallway and into the small parlour, and he sits down in his chair by the fire, and he takes a deep breath and lets it out slowly, a breath that seems to come from a place so deep inside him that he did not know it existed. The room is just a room. That is the thought that comes to him as he sits by the fire and watches the flames dance and flicker over the logs. The hidden chamber behind the panel is still there, and the panel still slides open when the knot is pressed, and the family still uses the room for its prayers and its masses. But the room is no longer a hiding place, not in the same way that it was. It is a room, a small, plain, stone-walled room that exists for a particular purpose, and that purpose is no longer a secret that must be kept at the cost of everything. The door can be left ajar, and the dust does not need to be swept so carefully across the threshold, and the green wool curtain can be drawn back to let in the grey English light. The fear that made the room a prison as well as a sanctuary has faded, and what remains is simply a space that is sacred and quiet and full of memory, but a space that is no longer defined by the danger that surrounded it. The family continues to live in the manor house by the river, and the years continue to pass, and the world outside continues to change in its slow, patient, inexorable way. The old laws are not repealed. Not entirely, and there will be times in the years to come when the old fears stir again, and the old vigilance is required once more. But the worst is over. The great slow-turning machine of persecution has ground to a halt, and the silence that follows is not the tense, watchful silence of the hidden room, but the ordinary, peaceful silence of a house at rest. The family walks in the long gallery and looks out the windows at the fields and the river and the distant hills, and they walk in the fields and along the river path, and they speak to their neighbours and go to the market and do the small, ordinary things that make up a life. They still say their prayers in the old way, and they still keep the faith that cost their ancestors so much, but they keep it with a little less fear and a little more hope. A hope that is no longer forbidden, but is simply a part of the fabric of their days. And sometimes on a quiet afternoon when the light is soft and grey and the rain is falling gently on the roof, one of them will walk to the end of the hallway and stand before the panelled wall and press the knot and slide the panel to the left and step into the small stone room that was once the only safe place in all of England. They will stand in the silence and the dimness and the faint, familiar smell of damp stone and old straw, and they will remember. They will remember the weight of the fine and the sound of the oath, and the face of the pursuivant and the long, slow years of waiting and enduring and hoping against hope. And then they will step back out into the hallway and close the panel behind them, and they will walk to the window and look out at the rain falling on the fields and the river and the grey, peaceful sky, and they will breathe. The breath will be deep and slow and full of a quiet, profound relief. A relief that has been earned over many generations and at great cost, and it will be the breath of a person who has lived through a long, dark night and has seen the first pale light of morning touch the edge of the world. The room is just a room, and the house is just a house, and the family is just a family, and that is enough. That is more than enough. That is everything.